It's a computer sciencey term, and so most programming languages are what they call declarative. You say, this is a can of beer, I open the can of beer, then I drink the can of beer, then I put it down, basically. Whereas...
This is brilliant.
Whereas the intent-based thing will be get pissed.
This is definitely what we want more of.
The intent-based thing is, I would like to feel a warm glow of having drinks.
I would like to get obnoxiously drunk by mid-afternoon on a Friday. How do I go about that, Siri?
And then something else figures out exactly how that takes place.
James, I do a next white paper about intent-based networking.
Yeah.
I want to use this beer analogy.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to do an infographic, I think.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We've got a super duper special one this week because Ian and I have been away, and we've got not one but two of our distant colleagues from within Informa, and we're going to do a bit of tag team. It might be a bit awkward. There's going to be some shuffling and changing of places because we don't have the capacity in this studio to have everyone on the whole time. But I'm delighted to introduce James Crawshaw, who's an analyst at Omdia, which is an analyst house that is also part of Informa, which we are, and Light Reading is. Hi, James. Welcome. You've never been on before, have you?
No, this is my first time. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's long overdue. And one of the reasons we've timed James's appearance, apart from the fact that it was long overdue, as we just said, for this week, is that we've all been to a trade show called Digital Transformation World, which is obviously about orange juice. No, it's not. It's about digital transformation. And we might even get into the semantics and the definition of digital transformation because it's become a slightly sort of hackneyed, sort of cliched term in so much as it gets chucked around, along with other sort of businessy cliches like DevOps and agility and that sort of
Closed loop.
And the cloud and all that. So it's going to be a bit of a buzzword special, but for a reason. It's not just a sort of aimless listing of buzzwords. So yeah, before we get cracking on that, we might as well just review how the trip went. It was in Copenhagen. It used to be in Nice, this event, and we should say it's run by an organisation called the TM Forum, where their main gig is trying to get different parts of the sort of telecoms world to work well with each other technologically and culturally. And they've been doing this stuff for a while, and they haven't had one since 2019 because of the goddamn pandemic. And in that time, they switched from Nice to Copenhagen. And initially, we were a bit pouty about it, weren't we? Because it's always nice to go to the south of France.
Telcos don't like change, do they?
No, we are. They don't like transformation, ironically enough. But then when we got there, I thought I'd never been to Copenhagen before. I thought it was a really charming city, just alarmingly clean and orderly. Everything just seems sorted.
Yeah.
There's no litter. There's no homeless people. There's no visible aggro or nutters charging around the place. Everything just seems sorted.
There are naked men diving into the water.
Really? So we had one.
Hello.
So we were walking. You know, Ian and I like to go for romantic walks by the river. We were doing that. I believe it's a river, or is it a dockside or an estuary?
Nyquist, it's called.
It's called what?
Nyquist.
That's the name of the... Is it a river?
Yeah.
Because you never know, because that bit of Denmark's all just tons of little islands.
Copenhagen's just an island.
Yeah.
In the sea, basically.
Right.
It's very close to the mainland.
But it is a river rather than a small bit of sea.
No, it's a river.
Right.
Yeah.
And we were just walking along, and it was all nice. And then we saw some lads, looked like they're, I don't know, early 20s, something like that, just jumping in the water. And I thought, well, how wholesome and healthy of them, because it must have been cold as shit.
Yeah, particularly for one of them.
Yeah, and as we got to get closer, we realised that two of them had swimming trunks on. One just went au naturel. And
Viking spirit.
Well, it's Viking spirit, and that was remarkable. We were looking around, and no one seemed to.
No one was batting an eyelid about it. That was the weirdest thing.
Like it's the most normal thing to do. And you got to tip your hat to the lads. I mean, I wouldn't have the guts to do that at the best of times, but certainly not in some cold water, with the inevitable consequence of emerging from that cold water. To which this lad seemed to be immune, I might add.
The foreshortening effect.
Which is probably one of the reasons he was so willing to skinny dip. And he was, and he's just in good shape and just generally healthy and Nordic, and it was all very nauseating of him.
Yeah.
But then
there weren't like a gaggle of women around, were they, sort of admiring him? Everybody's just getting on with their
just
day.
Normal.
So, whereas in the UK, people would have been laughing or taking photos.
You would have had the tabloids round in no time.
Or the police would have been out arresting him.
Would you say he was peacocking?
There we go. And I thought, apart from the fact that it was odd, I just thought it seemed sort of symptomatic of the fact that everyone there looks quite healthy. They're all riding on bikes. It's a bit like Amsterdam. You really have to watch out when you're crossing the street there, because they just come steaming along. They don't take any prisoners.
It's not as bad as Amsterdam for bikes, I don't think.
No, but it's a bit more surprising because Amsterdam's a bit more compressed. You can just get, you're getting out of a taxi, and then before you know it, you've got some Viking bearing down on you. So that was a funny thing, and that was when we were going off to have lunch with John Strand, who's another analyst who is Danish, and so he's keen to show us around. I don't know if he picked that as a tourist point.
No, he didn't know that was coming, I don't think.
In fact, I had to hassle him. I told him I would moan about him on the pod, because he's from Copenhagen. He's going, I'll take you a shortcut and we'll go there. Turned out he took us a long cut, and I just sort of worked out that we'd gone the scenic route, and I was giving him a hard time about that. But he took it well, I got to say. And thanks a lot. And then he took us out for dinner. Thanks a lot, John. Shout out to John Strand. Took us out for a very nice dinner, which, funnily enough, by pure coincidence, we went to 2 nights in a row, because we went out with Anais and Connor and Chris from CC Group, and they took us to the same place.
Must be good.
But it was good. They do a good ribeye steak.
Oh.
Yeah.
You'd know how to talk to me.
Yeah.
That was it. Any from either of you two? Any sort of highlights before we get into the actual main thing? Any sort of highlights from Copenhagen or the trip in general?
I mean, I was kind of sceptical when they moved it. I was probably one of the grumpy people saying it's not.
You grumpy?
It's not a good move because Copenhagen's really expensive. So I used to go there about 20 years ago, and it wasn't. I think someone commented, didn't they, when we were out, that the price difference isn't as much anymore because everywhere's really expensive. So it didn't seem that bad, but I thought it was really nice.
No, I think it was Shahid from the Mobile Network who also used to live in Copenhagen for a bit, and he reckoned that it's now sort of more or less similar price to London, whereas it used to be a lot more
price
pricey.
of beer, which is what I usually base it on, price of beer index.
That's the barometer.
I think back in 2000, when you could probably get a pint in England for £3 or something, I suspect in those days. It was like 7 or 8 in Copenhagen, I seem to remember, and it still seems to be about 7 or 8 in Copenhagen, but it's now 6 or 7 in the UK. So.
Oh, there was one other place where we got some. So they got some good. You go to a regular bar or pub there. It's like Carlsberg and Tuborg, isn't it?
Yeah.
But they're quite into their craft, like pale ales, like we like this BrewDog type of thing. And there was one place near the restaurant we went called War Pig, which I thought was excellent, missing only the Black Sabbath song on a loop.
Yeah.
Closed loop.
Closed loop, yeah. And that was a place that did about 10 or 15 different craft ales, and then it was doing like a Texas-style barbecue. So you'd
have liked it, yeah.
And so people were just walking there with trays and walking back with these trays of just steaming meat.
It looked exactly like the place that we went to in Austin.
Nice.
The food looked identical, so you'd have
it's all really rough and ready, and they just serve you on bits of paper, just sort of lob some mac and cheese at you and that sort of thing. But yeah, you could just eat that and then pass out, I'd imagine.
The other thing I thought was good in terms of where it was the actual conference venue, the Bella Centre.
Yeah.
I think this is, from speaking to people, this is one of the reasons they moved it, is that they felt the Acropolis was becoming a bit like an ancient ruin. So,
funnily enough.
And just not really fit for the digital age, having this event called Digital Transformation World in a place called the Acropolis with not
well, and also
bad
the architecture of the place, everything's on little mezzanines and different layers, so you don't get that sort of show floor experience.
Yeah, and it was really nicely put on. I mean, it sort of reminded me about, I remember Facebook back in the days when it was still calling itself Facebook, did one of their tip events in London at the Excel Centre.
Yeah, I remember that.
But they'd done, the Excel Centre is really depressing, but when you went into that particular conference, they'd done a really nice, the food was all good, and they made sure everybody could get a coffee easily, and it was nicely spread out but easy to get around. I thought it was really well organised.
Yeah, the facilities, they were good. There was always coffee and little pastries and the food and the little media bit. The media bit itself was big enough for all of us.
My minor grumbling about, if I wanted to complain probably about the media bit, is that it was thanks to, I think, Anais at CC Group, who went and asked for more PowerPoints to be put in, but at first there was nothing you couldn't sort of plug in.
Which is the most obvious thing to have. Everyone needs to recharge their
pretty minor gripe,
freaking laptops.
Yeah.
So, James, any thoughts more generally about the sort of new location of the event or Copenhagen or anything like that before we get into the nitty gritty?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, I'd been to Copenhagen before, but not for a few years. It's a beautiful city. I got there early on the first day, on the Monday, and took in a couple of museums. So a bit of culture.
So much more worthy than that.
Nice.
Yeah, and there was good nightlife. You know, had lovely meals and drinks, and I'd agree. The conference venue itself was great. So,
so thumbs up to him for him.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah. Before we go on, Pierre, did you want to talk about who's been listening to the pod?
Yes, the top 3. City of the month. So the first one is London. It's always a strong
Fair enough.
one. Yeah. Second one, it's actually not a city, it's an area in a city. And let's see if you can guess which city. It's called Guru.
My God, that sounds so Indian or Indonesian.
Oh, Indian.
It's in Seoul, Korea.
Oh, really?
The south one, obviously.
So if you'd gone Gangnam, we would have got that.
Yeah. So it actually identified a specific zone within Seoul. It didn't just say Seoul.
It's pretty top. So big. It's still like 2 million people, maybe. I don't know. And then the third city is Austin, Texas.
Cool.
Yeah, talking about barbecue.
Right. Do you think Joe Rogan's listening?
Yeah, probably.
I mean, Austin's got AT&T, hasn't it, and people like that. So,
but AT&T's in Dallas.
Yeah, but lots of companies are moving to Austin, aren't they?
It is apparently quite happening. Well, you guys have been there quite recently. It's quite happening, isn't it, at the moment?
It's quite techie. I think a lot of people are moving out of California because it's too expensive.
That's right.
So you're getting techie and entertainment types.
And Portland's too dangerous or something.
Well, Portland's full of nutters, full of like extreme like Antifa type of crazies. So I gather from my internet rabbit holes that I go down. Right, okay, so I think to introduce Digital Transformation World, I would normally sort of throw the ball straight at our guest just as a matter of politeness, but I think you're more expert in a lot of the technologies than I am, which is, believe me, no great compliment to you. And so I might just sort of give us like a top line view from me and maybe Ian, and then move on to you to sort of drill down a little bit more into some of the specifics, if that's all right.
Sounds good.
I mean, I only wrote one thing from there because I was doing other sort of commercial stuff and bits and bobs. I wrote one thing that was basically from the first sort of keynote-a-thon on the first morning, which is like about 2 or 3 hours of banging on, and the general. And I'm always looking. Because I'm not very good at. I noticed I sit next to you, Ian, and you're quite good at touch typing and just getting all stuff down. All I can do is give myself memory joggers and then just fill in the gaps sort of retrospectively. And I'm just looking for the big sort of overarching theme. And it struck me that they kept saying, from the TM Forum people themselves to the other people later on, the big theme was what they call hyperscalers, or what we might call public cloud giants or big tech or whatever. But the hyperscalers in the context of telecoms are primarily Amazon in the form of AWS, Microsoft in the form of Azure, and Google in the form of Google Cloud. So they're the big public cloud providers, and increasingly our world is hosting a lot of its technology on the cloud, owned by one of these people. And we've many times on the pod before. In fact, the guy from Microsoft we met who heads up their telco thing, we asked him if he heard of the pod, and he'd watched the one that Daniel Royston was on, because that was all cloudy, and that time that was definitely set up as a slightly antagonistic. Me and Ian are sceptical about this wholesale move to public cloud. She's a self-proclaimed cheerleader, even had the pom-pom. And so this year seemed to be the year where they were just going, look, this is just it. There's no point in arguing the toss about whether it's a good idea or not. It just is. And I sort of cheekily ended my piece with a paraphrase of the final lines of 1984.
It's time to stop worrying and love the public cloud.
Yeah, exactly. Which is how 1984 ends, when he goes, the struggle was over, he'd won victory over himself, he loved Big Brother. I just felt that was the kind of vibe I was getting, as they were going, we love the public cloud now. There's no moaning about OTTs, there's no moaning about them growing much faster than us, all that sort of thing. We're just embracing them. So I thought that was the most interesting theme of it. Did you concur with that, Ian?
Yeah, I thought the cloud was definitely one theme of the show. I mean, there are others that are more sort of nitty-gritty, I suppose. And that to me was maybe the biggest difference was the cloud. Because if you go back to the last time it was there in person 3 years ago in Nice, obviously Google and AWS and Microsoft, I'm assuming they were there, but I certainly wasn't.
Google's only just joined as a member.
Right, I certainly wasn't finishing off day one at a whiskey bar with drinks being served by Google Cloud or
Do you
being
remember what
asked
that
to go to
bourbon
a
was?
meeting.
They were giving us good slugs of this fairly smooth
Can't
bourbon.
remember the name of it, but it was good. Yeah,
Gave us a head
enjoyed
start
that.
on that night.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we had a meeting with Microsoft, as you said, a guy called Rick Liavano, who's CTO of the whole sort of telecom unit, the bit that deals with telcos, and so I thought it was a thing. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of talk about moving stuff into the public cloud. You know, whether a lot of stuff has gone into the public cloud at the moment. I mean, James has got the data about.
Yeah, well,
this,
we'll get onto that in one second.
But I know what you mean. There seems to be this sort of sense there's an inevitability about it. There used to be a conversation years ago where people would talk more maybe about, you know, what makes sense to keep out and what makes sense to go in, and now it seems that the decision's made almost that it's just
it's a matter of when, not if.
and now it seems to be more about, well, as we're going to do it anyway for a lot of the stuff that we have, and I think there's still going to be something that gets held back that doesn't make sense to put in the public cloud, but where we are moving to the public cloud, you know, now there's this concern about being overly reliant on one particular vendor, which we've already seen happening in the radio world with things like Ericsson and Huawei. I mean, funnily enough, even just this week, I think Ofcom came out with some big statement, which wasn't telco specific, but we need to look at the cloud services market and work out if there's...
Another manifestation of big tech.
So one of the buzzwords, you're talking about buzzwords that get thrown out recently, I mean, one of the ones that you're hearing more, I think, at some of these trade shows is multi-cloud. You know, you used to have multi-vendor, now there's multi-cloud, and how do we make sure that we're not sort of just using
lock in.
Lock in. I mean, Roseborough, who's one of your colleagues at Omni, did a good report on this that she was showing me at the show. It's quite helpful to look at that before going in with Microsoft. And
well, you've written yourself about
a few times
about who was it, Dropbox, and their experience of moving their IT, their software back onto their own private cloud because the cost of continuing to run it in public cloud was too high. It's all great for a startup. You don't want to have to go out and invest in a huge data center, but once you've got an established business like Dropbox presumably has, the economics for them made sense to bring it back in-house.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things because, and I think you spoke to some people about this maybe, but the assumption always seems to get made that running, you know, the hyperscalers, because then, as the name implies, they have these huge economies, that it's a sort of no-brainer, and it's more efficient to do it that way, and you'll save money. But it doesn't seem to be anywhere near as clear cut as that from digging down into the weeds and exploring it a bit more.
I think it depends. I mean, so what everybody talks about, the advantage of public cloud is this scalability. You know, if you don't know how much processing power you need, then rather than massively over-provisioning and having a lot of servers sitting around doing nothing all day, use public cloud. But if you know exactly how many CPUs you need day in, day out, then it will be cheaper to buy yourself.
And you can predict your scaling needs.
Yeah, or if it's all very linear, growing.
So is it for certain types of organisation that are more predictable, or certain features and functions that are more predictable where you'd make that decision? Is it easier for a smaller telco to make a decision about this than a bigger one maybe, or...
Well, essentially, it's the startup. So the startup obviously completely makes sense to do everything public cloud. But once you become an established business like Dropbox, better to move it back in. The other anecdote here, you're talking about the fear of lock-in to a particular public cloud. So do you remember Waze? It's like a navigation app.
Wasn't it bought by Google?
Bought by Google. So Waze had developed its software to run, I think, on AWS. Or Azure, one of those two. Anyway, Google bought it. It took them 3 years to move that software in-house. I think Microsoft has had a similar experience with LinkedIn. Continued to run LinkedIn on their rival's public cloud.
It's such a faff to do otherwise. That emphasises the vendor locking thing. In fact, we chatted to Rick from Microsoft about that. You know, when it is such a ball ache to move from one public cloud provider to another, is that, you'd think three is the minimum level that you'd say constitutes competition.
Yeah.
I think a duopoly's not enough. It's too easy for them to behave like cartels, even if they don't directly conspire with each other. It's too easy for them to just match each other on price or whatever. 3, you'd say, is the minimum for competition. I know there are other public cloud providers, but among the dominant ones, it's those 3.
But even if there's 5 for competition,
yeah, if you can't move it,
if you can't move
that's,
it,
well, that's my point. Yeah.
I mean, one of the weird things, just coming out to multi-cloud thing, is that I was talking. I don't want to name the operator really, because I think they were sort of saying this on background and maybe even off the record, but the point's valid. Yeah, that is a really hard one anyway. I mean, off the record, you shouldn't name them at all. On background, I think you can, but you can't attribute it to
sort of paraphrase it or something.
But the point was that for them, multi-cloud meant, we've got more than one public cloud in the mix, but we're still in some particular geographies just using one. It's not like they've got redundancy there. So even for like one country, they might only be using one public cloud, and then they're using a different public cloud in another.
Like the guy from Microsoft, who I got to say, when we were. He was very good at, there were very open sessions. There was one that Ian and I both sat in with him. I basically jumped on your session. And then there's one I sat by myself. I stress I did invite Ian, but he had something else to do. And he was very, very fluent and confident answering our objections. But essentially, he was sort of going, no, of course. But he said, we're all into the hybrid cloud, pick the right thing that's right for you and all that sort of thing. And I think of the 3, although I haven't had equivalent conversations with anyone, AWS or Google Cloud, perhaps Microsoft is the one that's most mellow about hybrid cloud, and that could be a product of its legacy as a sort of enterprise sort of company in a way that the other 2 aren't so much.
Well, they're also the more of a... I mean, they're the one in the middle, aren't they, I guess?
Yeah.
Google's the smallest by far.
I think Google's quite mellow about hybrid cloud as well, because they have this Anthos system software that enables you to very easily move from one cloud to the other. And obviously they've introduced
doesn't AWS have something like that as well? When you mentioned that?
This is interesting because there's another initiative that you told me about originally, actually, James. I was interviewing on something else, and you said there's this thing called Nefio that sounds like it ties it. I mean, I don't know. I've looked into it a little bit.
It's slightly different, but it is that's Google backed as well.
It's Google backed, but it says I don't quite know what it's intending to do overall, but there's certainly a multi-cloud element there about being able to manage your workloads across a multi-cloud environment.
So it's all Kubernetes based, and it's the idea of extending Kubernetes to do more stuff, but specifically for the telecom industry.
Right.
So, and just one point before I forget it, I wanted to make about some of this multi-cloud stuff. So the guy from Microsoft was going, look, you can have one function on this cloud, one function on that cloud, but that's still, let's say you've got your OSS, BSS or whatever on one cloud, but then you've got some other back office shit or whatever on another cloud. You're still stuck with that provider to host your OSS, BSS. So you have the concept of a multi-cloud environment there doesn't really exist when it comes to being able to, because the point of competition is to be able to threaten your provider that you'll leave and go to their competitor, and that's how it keeps them honest on price. But you can't, if you've got a certain function on their cloud, it's a hollow threat to go, fuck it, we're going to go and stick our OSS BSS on someone else's, because they know that you won't be able to do it. They'll call you a bluff.
The other one that I'm aware of that's made a big fuss about this is Snap as well. The Snapchat company, because I was sort of rummaging through their sock drawer, through their
SEC filings.
Their filings, yeah. And as you do. And there's all these statements in about how they use Google and AWS. But they said, but the systems that we have on each of them, there's no, we have some systems on one, and some systems on the other, basically. And if we had to, I mean, they describe it in quite detail in the SEC filing. They said if we had to move from one to the other, it would cause us considerable time and cost.
And no one denies that. Yeah. I mean, it's just a fact, isn't it?
Yeah.
Your point about LinkedIn seems to exemplify it really well.
But it doesn't sound like there's. This is a curious thing for me. It's not just a telco issue. This is obviously an issue for any company that's using the public cloud.
It's just particularly come up. But
it's funny that you have this big commotion going on in the industry at the moment about something like, about getting the interfaces in place in the RAN that allow you not to be locked in, and you can move a vendor out and pull someone's radios in, and we've got open RAN, and it becomes a bit more competitive, and let's get some smaller vendors in the market. Whereas the public cloud just seems to be. There's lock-in, and we're moving towards it. There's more of this kind of acceptance, and I mean, the very fact that it's the hyperscaler market, you're not going to be able to bring small companies in to compete by the very nature of it, I guess. But you would think there'd be more. I don't know. To me, you'd feel there'd be more of a push to have something that did allow portability. I remember Vodafone talking about this a bit with this stuff it's doing, with software engineers. We want to have this platform that allows you to be able to do that. But I don't know how convinced the analyst world is by that.
But just in terms of the portability, so these tools do exist. Red Hat has its Kubernetes platform that you can move your software from the one cloud to another, and it doesn't all break. Google has Anthos because as a challenger, thank you, to AWS and Azure, they want to incentivize people to use their
they've only got
software.
10% of the market apparently. So
I think what you were about to say, Underdog, would have been appropriate, but you were just being discreet.
And VMware has something called Tanzu, which does the same thing. So there are solutions to it.
But is there a downside? You're paying a bit more because you're using that as well as
the downside, as somebody pointed out to me, is that you've just found a new lock-in. Your lock-in is now Tanzu or Red Hat or Anthos or whatever.
Yeah. So because those companies that you mentioned, Red Hat and VMware, get sort of thought of as kind of private cloud, don't they? In the private cloud world, you use their platform, but you'd actually be able to take them and put it into take their stuff and put it into a public cloud environment. But you're just sort of creating another layer where you're then stuck with that, basically.
Yeah, and it should be stressed. I mean, that's one way in which I've slightly refined my position on this and made it less binary. You're always, to a certain degree, locked in with a major partner. I mean, it's a commitment. It's a fucking marriage, isn't it? The cliche that gets chucked around of the sort of legacy enterprise lock-in was Oracle, where this is an Oracle. This is not so much cloud, just more the sort of
databases.
The databases and the ERP and CRM and all that stuff. And so it's always going to happen, and that tension's always going to be there. We're not necessarily going to focus on it much in this, but that's a reality of Open RAN as well. And we've chatted about loads of times. Okay, so you can get away from the vendor lock-in to Nokia or Ericsson or whatever, but you might just be selling your soul to someone else instead, or some other small group of people, or some consortium, or a system integrator or whatever.
You are, but the systems integrator is another issue, I suppose, if you've got one company putting it all together and taking responsibility. But I think with Open RAN, I think it's well-intentioned, and if it did exactly what it said on the tin, then it would be... You wouldn't have that kind of lock-in, I don't think, as much, because you could come along and say, well, there's these components that we see ourselves wanting to move away from that, and then the idea is you can bring something in and just put it there and it works. It's not quite there, but that doesn't seem to be the same thing in the public cloud to me. It just seems a lot different from that,
Is that a good segue into the open digital architecture?
Well, do you know, that's just what I was going to do. So you've done it perfectly, because when we talk about organisations like TM Forum, who are supposed to exist to sort of facilitate this interchangeability and the ability for the whole ecosystem to play nice with each other, then does things like, and I'll hand over to you now, the ODA, which is this thing called Open Digital Architecture, otherwise known as ODA, which we think is mildly amusing. Does that perform that function, James?
Well now, Scott, thank you for asking.
Well, I'm so pleased you are.
So, of course, TM Forum is very well known for their open APIs. They seem to be well accepted. They're in all of the operators.
And an API is a bit of
RFPs.
software that enables communication between one bit of technology and another.
Application programming interface. It's so that two different systems can talk to each other and exchange information, and you don't have a massively complicated systems integration challenge. So they have sold that to the telecom industry, and they've bought it, and they're now part of all of the RFPs. And I did ask a few people who were demonstrating at these catalysts all these APIs, and I was asking how useful are they? Are they not a bit too generic? Does it still not leave a lot of nitty gritty work to do? And they said they were all singing off the same hymn sheet. No, this does actually take us a long way down the route of integrating. Yes, there are some final steps you need to do, and it's principally what they call the payload. So, for example, the MEF, used to be called Metro Ethernet Forum, they've designed a payload for carrier Ethernet services that uses the TM Forum API, or one of the TM Forum
So the MEF
APIs.
and TM Forum, because they just got in touch with me the other day, the MEF and the TM Forum, they seem ostensibly competitive in so much as they seem to do the same thing, but they're quite collaborative with each other, yeah?
Well, basically, a large North American telecom operator, hit MEF on the head and said, look, you need to play nice with these guys.
Otherwise
And
you're defeating the object of all this play nice
Exactly.
ethos, isn't
so
it?
rather than inventing your own API structure, take what TM Forum has done and enhance it. Define the payload, the actual information structure, how many columns and rows in the spreadsheet and all that kind of stuff. And that seems to be taking hold. So the open APIs, the 67...
Can I just butt in before you go on to the ODA with the open APIs?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I do know from having been to a few Digital Transformation World events, which is how TM Forum has been branding its annual jamboree for a while. Every year it's like, our APIs are doing so well, we've got all these catalysts, we chat to all these people, they say it's going really well. But there is that slight Groundhog Day thing. It's like, if it's going really well every year, why are we hearing the same... It's going really well every year. I mean, do you feel, as someone who's more sort of elbows deep in this stuff than I am, that there is tangible progress with all this stuff, even though it just seems to be the same talk about APIs and catalysts and collaboration every year?
Yeah, I don't get any sense that it's phony. I mean, just the one thing as a side note I would say is there is sometimes a bit of confusion about certification of open APIs. So if you get your software certified that it's compliant with API XYZ, you need to pay a fee to TM Forum, and then you can use that in your marketing. So that's great for TM Forum, it's lovely for marketing, but actually what the telecom operator is interested in is, does your system conform within an open API? They're not too bothered about, have you paid TM Forum for that certification? So lots of companies, they are designing their software products around these open APIs. They may not have paid for all of the certifications yet, because there's a cost. But the concept, and this is a sort of common language, is established.
Okay,
there isn't really
but to Scott's point about things not, things that sort of the sense that we're going there again. There was interesting because one of the executives in the morning session got up and Elisabetta Romano, who's she used to be Telecom Italia's CTO, but I think she's now CEO of Sparkle.
Yeah, and before that she was at Ericsson, wasn't she?
Yeah, I mean, I quite like her because she's
probably Italian, isn't she?
Yeah, and she did sort of get up and go, there's all this talk about APIs, but we still can't get, if we need to get a 10 gigabit service up and running with certain latencies on the fly, we still can't do it. And meanwhile, telco industries are flat, and the internet players are doing this, and the real business transformation isn't happening.
That was the more sort of contrarian.
And it was like, I've been here for 10 years now, and it's the same things. And I thought it was quite... Because I heard the same thing, James, about there is progress on people. I was talking to people and on your prompting, actually asking, are these open APIs any good, or are they too sort of general? And I had the same feedback as well. But we still sort of seem to be facing an industry that's not really sort of getting anywhere in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's not the silver bullet to solve the telecom industry's problems.
Yeah.
It will help to reduce cost, but it's not necessarily going to drive revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and OD, because that's open APIs, but ODA is a bit different, isn't it?
Open digital architecture is different, and it has been a bit nebulous and weird, and they have their own terminology about a canvas and what have you. And so we did look at this a year or so back and tried to sort of get our heads around it. It didn't really feel as though it was particularly concrete or useful, but it does seem to have got momentum. So Vodafone was always very on board with it. Axiata and Geo are also running on ODA. Exactly what that means, I don't know.
But Geo is obviously a massive partner to have involved, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And perhaps more interesting for me as an analyst, they've got this on their website now, they've got this component directory. So you can see a map of all of the different things in OSS and BSS. There are all sorts of different subcategories, and the confusing thing for me in the past was every vendor would have its own terminology. They'd talk about their customer experience, their digital whatnot, their catalogue for this, and they've now got a common language so you can compare and contrast, and the vendors have mapped their actual products to this taxonomy, so you can do interesting things like have a look at Amdocs.
So you can compare them more easily than you used to be able to.
Or from a telecom operator's perspective, if you are looking for a best in breed for this particular widget, you can go on the website, who are the guys who supply that widget or claim they supply that widget, and then at least you've got a long list to start working
That's
from.
often the cloud dream, and it was also, bear in mind I've only been doing this, seems like a long time, but I compare myself to you two, and I'm the novice in every respect. But when I first started at Telecoms.com, everyone was banging on about NFV, which isn't so buzzwordy anymore. But when I eventually understood the concept of it, the reason you would want to virtualize a network function is to create this sort of cloud directories, cloud shopping basket, like going to Amazon or something like that,
right, yeah.
where you just pick things off the peg and just whack them in. And that was my understanding of the point of virtualizing all these things, not just the efficiencies that you were talking about earlier, but the other buzzword apart from scalability is agility, and that's the agility bit, where you can just pick up and drop functions as and when you need them. And so is that sort of the latest manifestation of that kind of concept?
Well, I mean, it still would be an absolute nightmare, even if for widget X in the taxonomy you wanted to swap that out from one vendor to another. It still would be a big IT project. You're not going to just sort of, I'll have a go and see how this particular vendor works. So it doesn't completely eliminate all of these switching costs, but I think it helps to streamline the procurement process, get a better understanding of who does what, and it's at the end of the day, a lot of this is about having a common language, just so people understand each other. That's why we go to these conferences and talk to each other, and if people present on stage.
Now we're getting there. Have we got a bit more of a common language?
Yeah, another 10 years, I think we'll know what NFV means.
But it's got ODA's got more of a, sort of head of steam, I suppose, at the moment than, well, certainly something like ONAP.
Well, yes, ONAP is rather dead in the water. But the Linux Foundation does have other projects, the Nefio project, for example.
Yeah, well, when we mentioned that to, this is on the record so I can say it, but when we mentioned that to Rick Liovano at Microsoft, what do you think of that? He sort of went, well, we're looking at it. Does the industry really need another ONAP-like project?
Oh,
meow.
It does, Rick, and you should be on board.
I told Rick he's welcome on the pod, by the way.
Yeah.
I said it with some trepidation. I got a feeling he'd come on, and just like I felt chatting to him, I was just suddenly aware of my own utter inadequacies on the subject matter. And I know as a journalist I'm not necessarily supposed to be an expert, but I am a very specific journalist. And then you chat to this CTO from Microsoft of this, that and the other, and you're like, God damn, he's forgotten more than I'll ever know on this shit.
No doubt.
But, what can you do?
Yeah.
I am where I am.
But I thought he did a good job of talking about it to us in well, you as well. He did a good job of talking about it in a sort of
words of one syllable.
Yeah.
No, it's good.
He's CTO, but so he could have made it complicated, a lot more complicated than he did.
But then that's part of the job of senior technologists is to obviously talk to other Uber geeks, but talk to normal people as well. I don't mean that in a pejorative way.
Yeah, he has to sit down with commercial people and explain all this stuff, presumably.
Yeah.
So,
well, they're not normal. So you've just turned over a leaf of your notebook.
I know.
So why don't I invite you to use that
page 2 of 37?
What are some of the other bits and bobs you took from there?
How long have we got, Scott? How many hours left?
Anyone need another beer?
Oh, God.
While he's turning.
Can I just say, James has been drinking this like room temperature old speckled hen.
We need to save because
I like it slightly warm.
A subsequent guest who's coming on. We don't know who it is yet. It's going to be a surprise.
Yeah. That's true. I failed to introduce her. We need to save some bits for her. Okay, I'll slow down my drinking.
She did express an interest in the brew dog rather than the old speckled hen,
fine.
I think.
I'll switch to
I don't mind having an old speckled hen.
I don't blame.
Well, there's only one left.
Well, it's meant to be drunk at room temperature, isn't it? It's Old English ale.
Okay,
it's a kind of beer drunk by old men who sit in Wetherspoons at night.
I wonder sometimes whether people who listen to or watch this podcast, whether a highlight for them is us arguing the toss over beer logistics rather than anything to do with telecoms. They're like, oh yeah, I'm so pleased Scott and Ian found out who's going to have the speckled hen this week. Go on.
So getting back to the topic of open APIs.
You can be the grown-up.
We love open APIs.
We love them.
They have
IPAs.
Oh, I like that.
He's on form today. What was the other one that you came out with?
Peacocking. So they have open API'd this whole intent-based networking thing. So
intent-based,
which
sounds superficially very creepy.
It's a very buzzwordy thing that Apstra and other companies, started using in their marketing. A buzzword essentially. A few years back, Apstra recently acquired by Cisco, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to simplify it, I mean, it is basically you don't provide very detailed instructions for what the network has to do. You just say, hey network, I want an SD-WAN service that connects this customer in Sao Paulo or whatever. And the network figures out what it needs to do to get.
So that's
that
what
done.
I mean by intent-based, as opposed to being sort of starting with the technological challenge and working your way towards the endpoint. They just state the endpoint, and the cleverness sort of does all the rest.
It's a computer sciencey term, and so most programming languages are what they call declarative. You say, this is a can of beer. I open the can of beer, then I drink the can of beer, then I put it down, basically. Whereas...
This is brilliant.
Whereas the intent-based thing will be get pissed.
This is definitely
the
what we want more of.
intent-based thing is, I would like to feel a warm glow of having drinks.
I would like to get obnoxiously drunk by mid-afternoon on a Friday. How do I go about that,
and
Siri?
then something else figures out exactly how that takes place.
James, on your next white paper about intent-based networking,
Yeah.
I want
the
to
beer
use this
metaphor.
beer analogy.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to do an
Because-
infographic, I think.
Yeah,
So
the cartoon of some bloke going,
that's the idea. And there are, believe it or not, declarative programming languages. There's one called Prolog, and I can give you a book about it. It's very interesting.
oh, please do.
And you can say to the software, do this, and then there's an engine underneath that figures out how to do it, a logic engine. That's as far as I know. Yeah. Anyway, so to sort of make this slightly more tangible, the TM Forum have created a couple of open APIs. One of them which handles the management of this intent, and another one which brings us back to the closed loop. Another one which does some sort of AI closed loop magic.
What do we mean by that? So we've been joking among ourselves because we're trying to work out what the hell a closed loop is in this context.
Well, I guess the intent, you say your intent is provide this service between Brazil and, Bratislava or whatever. The system works out how to do it. The network is set up. It's continuously monitored. And if there's a link that breaks somewhere in that chain, the system figures out how to reroute and keep the service running without any human intervention.
So the idea is not to have anybody involved
Exactly.
in the process.
Get rid of all the
It strikes me that technological progress on the whole is a little bit like that. Each new sort of evolution of technology basically is built on the shoulders of the previous one, but it takes away even more of the plumbing. Like, those of us old enough, I didn't actually do it, but I was aware of it. When I was like primary school, early secondary school age, people would buy like a Sinclair Spectrum, and they'd actually just tap in this code called BASIC, and you could buy magazines, and you could spend about 2 days tapping in this thing, which if you fucked even one thing up, the whole thing broke.
That's the frustration.
And at the end of it, you'd have some stick tennis game. Anyway, but then you build on it and you get programming languages, so you don't have to know about the underlying code, and then you get WYSIWYG interfaces and all that.
So when it all
thing.
goes wrong, and all the old people who did the original stuff that's buried 10 layers under have died, then we're all completely screwed.
Yeah, well,
It's basically what you're saying, Scott.
Well,
that's one interpretation.
Well, Ian has put a downer on things, but
as is his wont, by the way.
I thought you were going to bring us on to, and I've not written it down here. I should have made a note of that. Low code, no code. You must have heard of
I
low
got told about low code, no code by Blue Planet actually last week. It was one of their new initiatives, together with putting some more network slicing goodies into their software.
Oh yes, network slicing.
Sounds like some kind of I don't know, geek cocktail.
Well, it's a similar thing, though, isn't it? But they just, the way they described it to me was a sort of effort to allow, say, less skilled programmers in a company to be able to do some of the things that you used to need very sort of highly qualified network programmers to take care of.
Yeah, because the people who run networks are not computer programmers.
Yeah.
So you've got to give them some tools so they can tinker with it a little bit, add some value around the edges. But not get their hands dirty with C++ or anything like that. Just drop and drag. I mean, stuff.
Just like the way most of us use
So
a computer.
even a total numpty like me with minimal programming skills could go and do something.
Minimal. You got some.
Well, yeah, on HTML. That's about
I suppose so. Yeah, I know how to put an image in a story.
It's not dissimilar to robotic process automation. You remember that buzzword?
Yeah.
And these systems,
I don't hear that as much these days. That used to get bandied around a lot a couple of years ago.
Yeah. I mean,
But you
those
don't hear
companies
people
are still
talking about it as
around.
much. Yeah.
It's still used.
But as far as I was understood it, that was about sort of automating quite simple desktop type jobs that you might, spreadsheet type things that you might need to do. You can use RPA to get rid of some of the tasks that would be involved.
I mean, the key use case was say you've got two applications and you've got to copy and paste information from one into the other.
Right.
Yeah, and you're literally Control-C, Control-V, two applications that don't talk to each other because to integrate them is a massive IT project that would cost $1 bazillion. Slap a bit of RPA on top, you teach it how to do this, copy and paste, and that's what it does.
Yeah.
So the question then is the RPA software cheaper than the 16-year-old that you get to do an internship and do all that copying and pasting overnight while he doesn't get any food?
It is cheaper because they've introduced a minimum wage in some countries, but also it's error-free. Once you set it up, it's error-free.
And one thing you wouldn't say about your average 16-year-old is that they're error-free.
They're definitely not error-free.
So let's move it back because we got to wrap up. So we got time for our other guest.
Okay.
So we got to wrap up in about 10 minutes or so. What else have you got on your notebook of wisdom?
Right. So I had a number of
Book
meetings.
of James.
The Book of James. I've had a number of meetings and picked up anecdotes, snippets from here or there. It's not a comprehensive survey of what's going on in the world, but it's just a sampling. And so most of the vendors I talked about, when I asked about is their software being deployed by telecom operators on public cloud, most of them said not much. Most of it's still going in the telecom operator's own data center or private cloud. But one vendor, who I can't name because it's they might not want this to be out there.
It was just a chat.
They surprised me. They said that 80% of their new deployments are going on public cloud, but they were the standout. The vast majority said.
And I wonder whether sometimes when you hear this thing that's a real outlier, you wonder whether they've got a business interest in really bigging that up. Like, have they just launched a new product? I don't know. I really don't know. Totally cloudy.
Did you talk to... Because I spoke to Guy Eriksson, who's head of their BSS. It's Mats Carlson.
Okay.
I think I've got his name right.
Sounds like
and I was
Eriksson
asking him
name.
how much of the BSS stuff goes into the public cloud now. And he was saying it's a little bit easier with BSS than it is with OSS because it's not as tightly linked to the network. It's a bit more like, the stuff that the sort of traditional IT workloads that you put in there. And he wouldn't give me a percentage, actually, but maybe I didn't press him enough for one anyway. So
it'd be hard to measure, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't get a sense of, in their case, what it was. But I just wonder if there are certain things I'm guessing that it's a lot easier to do and you wouldn't worry about it so much, and other things where, one of the things Scott and I were chatting to Microsoft about was when it comes to some of the network functions that you're putting in, you really want to be quite careful because you have to think about things like latency and other stuff. Although
the 5G core is a key use case, to use that buzzword again, for public cloud, isn't it? People putting their 5G core in public cloud. In fact, there's that Norwegian company, isn't there, Working Group 2, who are offering it as a service to mix the public cloud.
Was he the lad we had on?
Yeah, Ellen Prescott. We had him on the podcast.
Did you? Okay, he was good. Good.
But there's talk about doing it, but there's still quite a lot of resistance to doing something like putting the 5G core in. I know AT&T's got that big deal, obviously, with
Dish as well.
And Dish, but they seem to be the two quite extreme cases, don't they? And you talk to a lot of European operators about going as far as that.
Yeah.
The one who's on the record with it is Neil McRae at BT, who would thinks that's just sort of
that was funny.
A step too far.
When we were giving our
do it in his Scottish voice. A step too far.
Step too far.
I don't. He probably doesn't phrase it exactly that way.
No, I think we can all agree my Neil McRae accent's shit, but that's not the point. It's just a giggle. But that did come up. I think we were talking to the Microsoft guy. We were saying some operators are a bit more sceptical, and he said, "Are you talking about my friend Neil McRae?"
He did.
So Neil's known for it.
He's outspoken.
Which is good.
Yeah. So
that was my American accent, by the way.
the highlight of the show for me, most exciting moment, got hearts pumping. At least John Strand's heart pumping was with the Heretic. He stood up in a panel
John
session.
the Heretic.
And you know how panel sessions are often dull affairs where everybody agrees with the previous speaker and just says the same thing over again. He stood up in this open RAM panel and said, "No, it's all nonsense. It's all rubbish. It's not cheap."
I can hardly believe that he would do something like that.
That does sound like our mate Strandy.
Yeah, and it was hard to prise the microphone from his hands.
That also sounds like our mate Strandy.
But I have to say, fair play to him. It made it exciting.
So what was all bollocks according to him?
Well, that's putting this mishmash of Lego pieces together that you're going to end up with a fully functional Tesla motor vehicle. No, he thinks it's better that you...
We bumped into him just after, and he was telling us how he
did, but I didn't
word.
get a sense of what the reaction was to that on the panel, and whether anybody had anything to sort of. I mean, did they just go, "You're talking rubbish," or
did they just roll their eyes?
Did they try and sort of answer it in a more nuanced way? Maybe, I don't know, but.
It's hard, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's like it's a religious debate, and so no. They said, well, perhaps this is something we can discuss in more detail
Offline.
Take it offline.
Over several
Circle back.
Carlsbergs or something.
Circle back.
Yeah. So that was the highlight.
I mean, obviously this is a completely different rabbit hole, and so it's probably not fair for me to ask you about it. But on that,
is it on my script?
No, yeah.
Right.
on that sort of theocratic debate.
Ooh.
On whether Open RAN is going to deliver. I don't even know this is necessarily your core area of interest, so feel free to dodge it.
Yeah.
But are you more with the panel or with Strand on that one?
Well, you see, I love this open source, openness concept. It sort of appeals to me because nobody likes monopolies and all of that sort of stuff, or duopolies for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
But we have seen the failure of ONAP and things like this before, and I totally buy what Neil McRae is saying, is that when he came into BT, they had too many suppliers. It meant that there was too much integration and it was too expensive. He reduced the number of suppliers, and those integration problems largely went away or were much cheaper, and he saved a hell of a lot of cost. So, I think he's probably got a good point.
And there's a sort of basic cultural and logistics things. I'm aware of this when we do projects at Telecoms.com. Any time you have to involve a third party, you exponentially increase the complexity because you get delays in terms of email chains. You get miscommunications, you get Chinese whispers, you get differing expectations, all that sort of thing. The only way you can ensure something's completely smooth is to do it yourself, isn't it? So there is that.
Sadly, yes, yes.
Cool. What else on the list?
What's else on my list? Partner ecosystems. That's a buzzword that's been banging around for a while. It's the sort of holy grail for how telecom operators might possibly introduce a new revenue line, other than the pitiful 2% revenues they get from IoT.
We talked to some people about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Company called, I can never figure out whether it's Bearing Point Beyond or Beyond by Bearing Point.
Oh, they're not Bearing Point, they're just called Beyond Now.
Oh, is it? I've got I've even got their name wrong in my write-up then.
Yeah, there was Beyond Now, and there was a lady from TELUS, a Canadian operator who specialises in the IoTs kind of things.
Working with them, yeah.
But yeah, that whole... She came up with quite an interesting idea. Talking about partner ecosystems, she came up with an interesting idea, which is that... you've got these operators trying to get into other verticals, to use one of those annoying terms, i.e. other industries.
TELUS has done quite a lot on healthcare, for instance.
Yeah, so they're quite good on healthcare. I'll just quickly finish this. They're quite good on healthcare.
He's going to push back, so this is good.
Sorry,
okay, maybe they're not. Maybe they're not.
Yeah,
We'll do push back, but I'll just make my rudimentary point. They're quite good in healthcare. Someone else is quite good on financial services. Why don't they collaborate such that both can offer healthcare and financial services to both their markets? That was just sort of
two telecom operators collaborating. One in Canada, one in Brazil or something. Yeah.
And then you overcome some of this scale effect that the hyperscalers have
Yes. That is a good idea. But I do think you need some sort of singular entity that provides that link between them. And
then you need to get APIs, basically, James.
But no, I think you need an actual business.
Cultural, an actual
so
organisation.
actually, no, that's a good point. But I do want to push back on. No, fair play to TELUS. They're lovely, but they have acquired their way into healthcare. It's not an organic development, and whether they have actually created any value through this acquisition.
Well, this is what I can get from her. After several times, I think during the interview, I was saying, what's the revenue side like? Has it grown? And it always seemed to end up with the discussion going on and in another tangent. And I was like, well,
yeah.
And we were both, just as you were saying, with the minuscule margin you get from IoT, we were both pushing back a bit on that as well. I don't know if she necessarily expected to have a couple of gobshite journalists giving her grief on that stuff.
But on your point about collaboration between operators globally, the way it could work, potentially, is through one of these sort of Twilio-like companies. So Ericsson bought Vonage,
Yeah.
principally with this objective in mind.
About APIs as well, isn't it?
Network it's called network exposure.
No
Right.
one's convinced though.
No
by
one's
that,
convinced.
by that Vonage takeover.
We'll no. I'm sure we'll get some decent.
There's a thing on Monday. As
Yeah,
yes, there'll be some scepticism there. Principally,
Yeah.
You mean
know,
today?
Yeah,
today there's a Vonage update.
That's
Tune
just
in later
happened.
after you've just listened to the podcast.
So there's a few companies out there, and Nokia would also like to create its own ecosystem and enable operators to collaborate. Because you've hit the nail on the head. The problem that the telecom industry has is it's fragmented,
Yeah.
and the advantage that the hyperscalers have is that they're global,
Yeah.
and that is a tough nut to crack.
All right, I think that's quite a good note on which to end it. We didn't
Little red book.
we didn't get too much into the big is sort of getting in bed with the hyperscalers good idea or not, but I think we kind of covered it at the start
We did all that. Scott.
well, not too.
You were there.
Okay, we I guess we could have got into it more, but then I also think I'm gonna sort of contradict myself, because the theme of that event was, well, it's happened, so there's no point in arguing the toss about it. So I suppose in keeping with our review of that event, it's fair enough just to leave that there. But I'm sure we'll get back again.
Yeah. Well, we talked
Before-
about it more from a technical point
Yeah,
than a
exactly.
philosophical point,
Which is
I think.
appropriate
So,
having
yeah.
James here. Thanks a lot, James.
Thank you, Scott.
So normally we keep you on to just talk about some other stuff you don't give a toss about.
Oh,
But because we have another
specialist
colleague,
subject.
because we have another colleague lurking in the wings, we're going to get you to swap out of there. So cheers for that, mate. But we'll make sure that we get you on much more regularly from now on.
Thank you for the speckled hen.
Yeah, it's a
John
pleasure. Well, I
Baker.
think you could thank. Who brought that?
I think it was John Baker from Mavenir.
It is.
Right,
Yeah.
there we go. So you can thank him.
Thank
Cheers,
you,
John.
Thank you, John.
It's
Shout out to John.
open beer,
Is it?
literally.
Have you only done half of that one?
Can I take it with me?
Yes,
can,
please
if you
do,
want.
because
Thanks,
otherwise the
Otherwise-
next guest will think,
otherwise-
should I be finishing this or got another one for me?
Otherwise, we'll go. Welcome to the podcast now. Mine Sweet James's Speckled Hen.
Right. Okay. I'm going to
Okay,
try and
yeah.
navigate this.
Yeah.
Nice
Cheers,
to see
mate.
you. Okay.
Thanks, James.
So I'll just sort of fill the dead air a little bit, although this might end up.
Good.
If Pierre ever does the actual editing, it might come out.
No, that's good.
Or if you've got to splice in a bit of music or something like that.
Well, he doesn't have to splice in music. We can talk about how he's just basically knocked his beer can all
Knocked his
over the
beer all
studio.
over this
Thank God it was empty.
expensive
But it was
kit.
empty, fortunately.
But yeah, it's funny at an event like that, and having someone as knowledgeable as James, you could just go down the rabbit hole almost indefinitely. But now we're going to introduce, come and have a seat. So another colleague of ours. This is Paula Gilbert, who edits a journalistic website called Connecting Africa.
Hi,
Which is
guys.
you might hi,
Hello.
Paul. Welcome.
Thanks.
And Paula has been on the pod, but quite a while ago when you just
A long time
started,
ago,
really,
yeah.
wasn't it?
Yeah,
How long have you been doing this?
3 years.
3 years. So it was probably
So
not
it was like
long
2019, yeah.
after. Not long after you started. Of course,
I was saying to Ian, then South Africans got banned from the UK for a long time, so I couldn't come visit anymore.
we did. Well, we had, didn't we? We had that weird bit with COVID, where Omicron first cropped up in South Africa, didn't it? And everyone completely.
did
Well, it might have done. We don't know. do
That's-
we,
well,
really?
that's how it was reported here.
They just discovered
We
it
just have
first.
clever scientists who discovered
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Yeah, but actually it had been in Belgium.
But
or
that's
somewhere.
like
Right, right.
the countries that always discover them first were either South Africa or the UK, and then it's like every other country went, "Oh my God, no! It's a South African variant," but it could have been everywhere.
Yeah, it got
so-
labelled the South African variant, which was
Yeah, and do
problematic.
you know what I thought? Even at the time.
Thank you.
I thought there were several things wrong with that. Firstly, you always had these variants that were given names, which were obviously just geographically sort of obtuse. It just happened to be, as you say, where some people have identified it. But then in the media, if it gets called the South African variant, you've got this picture of these sort of zombies wandering around infected by this thing that the rest of the world's immune from. And if we just build a massive wall around South Africa, we'll all be safe.
Well, then it was like the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa. They were like, everyone, now no one can come anywhere.
Really?
Yeah, it was like Botswana, like mostly southern.
Right.
They banned all the countries around us as
And
well.
yet the African continent actually was, this obviously isn't, we're not just going to talk about COVID
Yeah, you
for the
know.
whole time.
We're
But
gonna talk
the
about
whole African
colonialism, are we
continent, when you
I'd rather
consider
not.
that it didn't lock down, I mean, I don't know on a country by country basis, but it didn't lock down that much. And to some degree, I imagine a lot of Africa healthcare facilities are less capable than they are in richer parts of the world. And yet, pandemic-wise, Africa wasn't hit too bad, was it?
I mean, I don't know if the numbers were being reported exactly correctly, if people were actually testing as much. One of the interesting things in West Africa was that because of Ebola, they had systems in place already for like quarantine type
Right.
situations, because Ebola was, I mean, I don't want to say worse, but
Yeah.
the symptoms were pretty...
Certainly more
I'd rather,
dramatic.
I think
more-
I'd rather
yeah.
get COVID.
Yeah,
if given a
so
choice.
so they had a lot of that stuff in place, which was interesting. So those countries seem to cope better.
But that is one of the reasons they have because the populations are quite young in a lot of African countries. Is that a factor? You know,
I bet. Yeah, it must be.
Yeah,
There
I
must
guess
be
a
that
lot of Europe
demographic
have
thing.
old populations. So
Yeah,
And I
it's mainly
wondered
an old
about
continent.
like with viruses. I just wondered about temperature.
Yeah.
Because viruses only really. Why do you keep having to, Pierre keeps having to dick around with this audio
Paula got in
mixer?
and she's bringing some interference.
Paula's bringing.
I'm sorry, what
She's
have I brought?
electric.
She's not just brought in Omicron. She's fucked up the audio
Is
thing as well.
It's good now. She's,
Is it fun?
Anyway,
You didn't play a little thing. Oh,
well,
you're gonna
you
do
might
it,
cut that in after.
because you don't have your phone.
Oh, I
That's
put
a
it over
watch.
there. Though.
You could at
Is that
least
a problem?
have,
Is it my watch?
Your phone is here?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe that's it. I'll
Move
just
it
bring
somewhere
it.
else.
He has this thing about phones not being above table height.
There's some like
That's-
the,
The mixer
That's
has that. Not
yeah, the
me.
mixer doesn't like radio frequencies buzzing around. Basically,
We're good.
Okay. Is that
Now
better?
we're good.
Sorry, it was my phone.
Okay.
Apologies.
God, nice one, Paula.
I mean, we're talking about telecoms.
Okay, well, that's given us a good opportunity to stop banging on about plagues.
Yes,
because
let's
that's not.
do
This
that.
is not the plague.com podcast. So yes, it's your second time on, but there's been a big gap for the aforementioned reason, and it's great to have you back. And I just thought, I mean, you're in town anyway. We didn't just get you over from South Africa just for this.
I mean, wouldn't that be nice?
Maybe we'll have a little budget chat about that.
I have a quarterly just for the podcast.
Yeah. Well, but you know, it would be welcome because you know we do cover Africa every now and then, but it's definitely not a strength. You know, from Telecoms.com, it's sort of mainly UK, Western Europe, and then other sort of massive economies like the US, China, India, something like that. So it's really interesting just to chat to someone who's there, sort of obviously geographically embedded, but that's what you write about every day. And I thought I'd just start by chatting. Well, I suppose a good place to start, we were talking a little bit beforehand, a good place to start is just like current sort of overarching sort of journalistic themes. You were mentioning the sort of 5G switchover. And the I think the phrase they use is sunsetting, isn't it? When they're shutting
that's
down
the
old
popular
networks.
one. Yeah.
So why don't I put the ball in your court and just get you to give us. So bear in mind our audience might not hear about Africa that much from us. So just give us like the top down. What's going on there?
Well, I think obviously 5G has been rolling out slower than in the rest of the world because a lot of countries were still kind of rolling out 4G, and that's maybe more of a priority for a lot of places than 5G. But we've seen this year quite a ramp up. I mean, South Africa was one of the first, 2019. There have been quite a few launches, 2020, 2021. This year we've already seen Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and then this month Tanzania, and this week actually Nigeria.
Is that a proper way to pronounce it? I always say Tanzania.
I think you can say it either way. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
It's just my weird accent.
Well, I'll defer to you. I mean,
Tanzania,
you're African,
Tanzania.
I'm not.
I don't know. People say it both ways. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, we're seeing a lot more 5G. Lots of people are still testing, piloting. So sometimes I'm like, people are announcing, "Oh, we're piloting." I'm like, is that really launching? Or you sort of? It's all a bit confusing.
But it seems to be moving fairly. I mean, it's quite slow moving in parts of Europe. Actually, you look at maybe the difference between 4G was more pronounced, where it moved quite quickly in places like the UK with EE's rollout, and yet 5G we're still only at 50% they say, and whereas Africa seems to have got going fairly fast compared certainly so with something like India where they haven't even.
But I mean, I think the thing is, like, do we really need it? Do we need those super fast? You know, is 4G enough for a lot of places? I think for Africa it's definitely going to be more fixed wireless access kind of thing than mobile. Because the phones are so
fixed
expensive.
Infrastructure. I mean, again, through a lot of this conversation, I'll have certain preconceptions about Africa that I want you to correct. So I'll generalise, but I want you to tell me I'm full of shit when I am.
I mean, it's quite tricky. It's a big continent. There's a lot of different countries.
So yeah,
you
even
can't
you
really
might
generalise.
overgeneralise.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, sometimes you have to, but it's
like
very diverse.
even in places, even like relatively developed African countries like South Africa, I'm wondering what the fixed line infrastructure is like. And this is you talking about fixed wireless access and 5G. You know, is it particularly compelling, the fixed wireless access
rather than fibre
argument in Africa versus, let's say, the UK, where most people have got some fibre going quite near their house?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, South Africa's a lot more advanced, I would say. There's a lot more fibre, but it's still only in big cities. So, like, my parents live on a farm.
Just noticed you've got an Africa necklace.
Yeah.
Cool. Sorry, just caught my eye.
So, yeah, fibre. I mean, at my house in Durban, I have fibre. So I don't really see the need for, like, 5G to run, you know, my normal work work life. But I mean, obviously, it's the industries that you need super fast. I mean, if you're doing remote surgery or things like that. But for mobile, I don't know. Do we need our videos to load that much faster?
No, let alone when they start going on about sort of AR and VR. Like you're going to be using mobile for a VR headset. You're just never going to do it. It'd be at home on Wi-Fi, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So somewhere like where your parents live outside the city, would they rely on FWA already, or are they using?
Yeah, so they're using like a smaller internet service provider that is coming. It's more like 3G, 4G.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot is LTE actually.
Even for that ends up being their broadband.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But that must be pretty slow.
It's not too bad actually.
Not too bad.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So back to your point about the argument for 5G then.
No, I don't know. Maybe I'm just. I think it's a lot of like buzzword things. Everyone wants to say they're launching 5G, and I guess it's going to eventually roll out. And then by the time Africa's doing that, 6G will be launching here. I don't know.
Yeah.
So the interesting one at the moment is the South African government announced last week that they want to sunset 2G and 3G. So 2G by the end of 2024, and then 3G by March 2025, which seems very
Quite
soon.
Short timescale, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and
we were talking about this before coming in because that's the main technology, isn't it, for a lot of people?
well, so at the moment, like if you look at the Omdia stats, only 4% of mobile is on 2G at the moment, and a lot of that is obviously like machine-to-machine IoT type things, but 60% of the traffic is still on 3G.
Wow.
And
so
then,
because we've moved ahead with 4G, I guess, more aggressively in this country,
the mix will change. It'll become more and more 4G, and 3G will go down. I mean, Omdia, I think it'll be, by the end of 2025, it'll be like 22%. So this is just South Africa. But my thing is, I still think that's too much for you to turn off a whole tech.
Yeah.
If there's still 20%.
I mean, they agonise over it.
it.
We chat to people like BT when we went to their briefing that we talked about on the pod, and then Vodafone. God, that was like last year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But they were talking about how they're agonising about turning off 3G just because a couple of pensioners might get freaked out by it, let alone 60% of the population.
But the interesting thing to me is the contrast here is the one that they expect to be easier to switch off is 3G because, as Paula says, 2G is still used for some sort of legacy M2M stuff.
Yeah.
And you also need it there, apparently, it's the only real thing that you've got for sort of global roaming.
Right.
And
even like point of sale devices. In South Africa, a lot of car trackers.
Yeah.
So like anything that's location based tracking kind of things, a lot of it runs on 2G. So they could migrate, but it's going to cost that industry a lot to turn it to 4G. I mean, if we're turning off both.
Totally. And because 4G here is so widely deployed now and everybody has a 4G phone almost, apart from a couple of pensioners who are still using old Nokias. If you get rid of 3G, it's not really that much of an issue. There's like you say, it's a couple of pensioners somewhere, but
the market is quite different.
Buy them off
totally
with
different.
trinkets.
Yeah, so it's also an affordability thing. So I can kind of understand on the one hand the government's saying they want people to have better experience on phones, so they should be using 4G, they want people to be more connected. So I guess if you force people to not have anything else, then they have to move. But can they afford it? I mean, or are they going to subsidize? The phones are getting cheaper, but they're still buying a Nokia that works on 2G is still way cheaper than buying a smartphone.
Yeah.
You do have cheaper 4G sort of like smart feature phones also. They have these like sort of hybrid crossover ones. But I just worry there's a big portion of the population that won't afford it. And then maybe you cutting them off from access if you're literally saying we won't allow any more on the networks.
Obviously in a sort of ethical or humanitarian way, that seems out of order, but it doesn't seem that makes that much sense from a business.
But is it like a firm, this is by this date,
No,
this will be
it's like
done? It's like an ambition or...
Well, it's like a draft policy that they've released.
Right.
So they are open to discussions on it. They have put specific timelines though.
Yeah.
But I think the telcos are all going to say like it's too soon.
It's interesting
When I spoke to them, they all said, we're very pro turning off these things because they want the spectrum.
They want to,
They want to be able to use the spectrum for 4G rather than for 5G or whatever. But I think the timelines are too short, especially for 3G.
Those switch-off things that governments announce are usually driven by the telcos in Europe. It's like the telcos say... So I spoke with Scott Petty, who's the he's now the sort of chief digital
Group
officer
CTO or whatever
of Vodafone about this, and he was saying it's nice to have government support for like a deadline for when we should switch off 3G, because it gives the industry something to work towards, and then the equipment community knows that's the sort of sunsetting date, as they call it. I like to call it putting it out of their misery, really. But and then,
sunsetting makes it sound so nice.
Yeah,
taking it into back
but I
garden.
mean,
and
the dates in the UK are really far out. They're like
No,
it's
exactly.
2030 and 2032, I think, for 3G and 2G or something.
Exactly.
It's-
And then South Africa's like, let's do it in 2025. But I mean,
we laugh at your teeth 2030.
yeah, but I mean, the government's never been very good at meeting their own deadlines, so I really doubt it's going to
So it's
happen
just
in
sort
that
of
time
lip
frame.
service.
Well, I
probably.
mean, our digital migration for TV has, like, we missed the deadline in 2015, or something, and like it still hasn't migrated.
Well, so, this is a complete tangent. It just occurs to me at the time. I mean, South Africa, probably of all African countries, is the one we hear about in sort of current affairs in the news the most. Certainly since around the time of getting rid of apartheid, Nelson Mandela, and all that sort of thing. And then I've got the impression that subsequently, I haven't really paid that much attention. It's been a bit politically
It's quite
up
a long
and
time
down.
ago,
Yeah, I know.
We're
But
talking
it's
about
been a
the
bit.
90s.
What have you had?
You just haven't
have
looked
had-
into it since the 90s.
Yeah, basically. So what's been going on since the 90s, then, Paul? No, but I just got the impression that
I went to
politically,
school and then
politically, it's been a bit of turmoil, hasn't there? How's it these days? Is it a bit more stable?
I mean, yes and no. There's always drama going on.
Right.
Um,
And I mean this in the context more of like, are they able to make useful
I
decisions?
mean, the British
like,
politics is not going very well at the
No,
moment.
believe
So
me, I'm not. This is not a critique from a position of strength at all. But no, I'm just wondering whether, in terms of the functioning of the government, whether there's such a high degree of turmoil that other things such as technological decisions and regulation and that sort of thing gets held up, or if it's all ticking along all right.
it's a bit of a mix. I think it's for all governments. It's the same. Like, they really want to be very technologically advanced and all those things, but regulation always does hold everything back. And all over Africa, regulation can be a problem, and it's so difficult to get licenses and so difficult all those things.
Do you have big auctions like you do everywhere else?
What do you mean, spectrum?
Yeah.
Yeah, so South Africa was waiting for literally almost 15 years, and then the auction finally happened in March this year.
So what holds that up? When you say waiting for 15
goodness
years?
knows that
Right.
the regulators,
Just bureaucratic gunge.
They released something. Then the Department of Communications took the regulator to court.
So
There've been so many
okay.
court cases. It's just over the years.
I
But
think
eventually it
the,
did happen. So the Telcos are very happy. They have more spectrum now. But they always say, we need more spectrum. Then as soon as they get it, they're like, we still need more, please.
Right.
So-
I mean, India is an interesting sort of point of comparison with auctions being delayed for a long time, because they always seem to get pushed back and happen a lot later than they ever intended. And I think the 5G stuff they've done, one of the reasons was, I don't know if you track that market ever and read
Not
what's
too much,
going on
no.
there,
But there are some similarities, I think.
I mean, they had a huge period of consolidation, and then there are three operators that are left, one of them struggling heavily. Vodafone Idea is sort of
Having a nightmare.
and they're all quite heavily indebted, I think.
Oh, really?
And it was a case of, and then you've got the government coming along and saying, well, we want to charge minimum base prices for this spectrum, and the operators are going, well, we can't really afford it. So if you have an auction now, no one's going to buy anything, and maybe it's a bluff, I don't know. But then they sort of say, can you kick the auction down the road and do it in 2 years? But your point earlier when you were saying, why do we need 5G for anything? It's like, we've got a decent 4G service. It's good enough for mobile broadband. If we're not all doing virtual reality services or anything, do we need to?
Or self-driving cars,
maybe it's better to release
really.
that. Yeah, release that spectrum for. I mean, I hate the idea of auctions personally. I just think it's.
so much money.
They always feel like government profiteering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think the whole thing, that whole process needs looking at.
Well, I
it
mean,
doesn't seem to be in anybody's favour.
Years ago,
really,
sort of bitching to Ofcom about this, and their sort of fairly tepid response was like, well, it costs money to make sure all this shit's done properly. And it's like, fair enough.
But it doesn't cost 40 billion or whatever was spent.
But then if it
during that.
costs a certain amount of money,
Yeah.
if it costs, let's say, to run Ofcom costs 10 million a year, well, then you got 4 operators, you get them all to chip in 2.5 million, job done. You don't have to have a fucking auction, do you?
Yeah.
So,
It's 20,
and then it's always like the
3G.
richer telcos can get more spectrum, you know what I mean? And then it always ends
well,
up
there's that
way.
as well.
Yeah.
There's that
If
as
you're
well.
going to auction it, that's,
Do they talk a lot about doing, with 5G and what it could be used for? Is there as much focus in Africa generally, not just South Africa, but in some other parts of the continent about business opportunities and doing stuff in the enterprise sector.
I think that's more the market. It's going to definitely be more for enterprise.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone talks about it's all the same things. It's going to be great for healthcare and all the industries and the speeds and everything.
The remote surgery one that you mentioned is one that gets thrown up a lot.
But I mean, how often you're really going to, I mean...
Yeah. Whereas who'd want to go under the knife of a robot is the other thing.
Somewhere in the fields.
Some drone buzzing towards you with a scalpel extended.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
all the use cases are really very futuristic and, I mean...
Yeah.
I don't know if we should rather be focusing on other things, but that's just me. But I mean, I guess technology always has to move forward. You can't be like, okay, well, why bother? Let's just stay with 4G.
Yeah, there is that.
So I guess that's the kind of the thing. Everyone has to keep moving forward. Otherwise, they're going to lose ground to all these international kind of...
Yeah. Do they? Is there a lot of focus on? I mean, one of the discussions we were having before you came in, that was less technical OSS BSS stuff, was just about hyperscalers generally, internet companies, and we were saying Scott and I were in Copenhagen this week for this big event, and they were a lot more sort of noticeable than they were last time they had that event back in 2019.
Oh, that's interesting.
But in Africa, do you get? There's always this talk about in Europe at the moment, and the US, I think, as well, about that relationship between the telcos and the big internet companies, and concern that they're eroding revenues that used to go to traditional communications players, and how does it play out? I mean, is that similar in Africa, or is it?
I don't know.
Very,
we are seeing a lot of
these
hyperscalers coming in. Like the data center boom is really happening.
Right.
A lot more cloud players, but I don't know about the revenue mix part of it.
I remember Liquid Telecom doing stuff like this quite a few years ago. Liquid Telecom was in for building data centers, wasn't it, in Africa?
Yeah, and there are a few big ones. So actually the company that owns them it's called Africa Data Centers.
Right.
And they're building all over, and Raxio is building all over.
Yeah.
And in South Africa's, like the last few years, AWS, Azure, like a lot of the players of Huawei. They love Africa, so they go there with their cloud,
And to best of my knowledge, no one in Africa's given Huawei a hard time, have they?
No, I mean that's
not as much of a hard time.
No.
Well, that's the other interesting one, I suppose, isn't it?
It's been very bad for their phone sales, sadly, because a lot of people used to use their phones.
Yeah, but they can't get proper Android, let alone the chips.
If you can't get Google stuff, I mean.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
I'm not so sure about the Huawei app gallery.
Has that been a factor in sort of holding up? You talk about adoption of data services and people... What's he doing now?
He's changing the battery on the camera.
That's all right, I'll let him off.
There's always some tinkering going on in the background, isn't there?
I work very hard.
One day we'll be in the middle of a pod and he'll be getting out a welding torch or something.
But people adopting, ordinary people being able to use the data services on their phones, and obviously it's not cheap to buy a data handset, and the Chinese equipment makers are well known for being quite aggressive on cost and providing low cost but quite capable devices. If you've got this situation where suddenly Android's not available really on Huawei,
not proper Android.
Has it been a bit of an issue for African markets in terms of being able to get people online, even? Or
I mean, I think it's made a big impact on Huawei's like handset sales. Because I think people have decided to rather buy other products rather. A lot of the Chinese brands do quite well, the cheaper ones, because they bring in like
You've
decent,
still got
cheap,
Oppo,
smart.
Oppo,
Xiaomi, exactly.
Yeah.
They all do pretty well across Africa, of course, because they're cheaper.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people are still buying Huawei's, but
I mean, even in the UK, like when I'm buying for my kids, you can get a perfectly decent smartphone for a couple £100 here, and I presume there are equivalent ones that hit the price points for lower GDP countries, such as you have in Africa.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I mean, we were talking about it earlier. We talk a lot about Africa being so mobile, but it really is. I mean, majority of people, that's how they connect. They probably wouldn't have internet at home. Majority of people maybe at work, but all of your online life is basically on mobile. And then there's so many interesting services that kind of have come out of that. So Fintech, I mean, is much bigger. You and I were talking about it.
Yes.
Quite a different beast in Africa than it is.
And we're
in other
reflecting
places,
what a good segue that is from the previous thing where we were talking with James and talking about digital transformation world, because that actually, all that stuff that we have at digital transformation world and all these things about open APIs and ODA and all that sort of thing, the point of it is supposed to be so that these operators can then innovate more and not just be a dumb pipe and offer more services. And it's funny enough, you look at Africa, which in terms of, GDP per capita is the poorest continent in the world, but actually that's where a hell of a lot of the innovation, they're more innovative, perhaps as a result of that, than they are in Europe. So tell us a little bit more about the fintech side of things.
Well, I think it's cool because people are actually solving problems that are real. Do you know what I mean? Whereas like a lot of apps are designed because it's like a fun thing to have or whatever. Whereas all the fintech things are, I mean, Mpesa is obviously the biggest example. That it like really solved problems of how people could move money around.
So that's Kenya.
It started in Kenya, yeah.
Okay.
And it was a Vodafone thing in it originally, was it?
Yes,
Vodacom? Safaricom, right.
Vodafone,
Get my
Vodacom, they all
screwed up.
owned
Right.
by each other.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, Vodafone owns
very
bits of all of
incestuous,
them.
basically.
Yeah, it's very incestuous, yeah.
Fair enough.
So Vodafone always claims it, but I mean, Safaricom were the ones but they own Safaricom to some extent.
I see.
But that's gone out of Kenya now,
Yes, so I mean, still huge in Kenya. Majority, I mean, Safaricom's so dominant in Kenya. It's the biggest operator. I mean, Mpesa is just
and what
used everywhere.
just for people listening who might not know what Mpesa is properly, how did it sort of start?
So it was like the very first
now?
mobile money service. So it actually started this problem of people going to the city, making money, but needing to send money back to their relatives in villages. And so they literally would put money in an envelope and give it to a bus driver, and it would drive back to the village, and that happened in a lot of African countries. Or they would have to pay these wiring services that then take a lot of money, and it was all really difficult.
Western Union type stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they came up with a mobile way. So it was all on USSD to begin with. So you would go, there was an agent, you would take your money to the agent and he'd transfer it into like a virtual something. You would send that to your relative on their phone, and then they could go to an agent in their village and get the physical money out.
Okay.
So that's like the most basic way it started working. Then of course with smartphones now they've got apps. You can pay your electricity bills, your all your services for the Kenyan government. You can transfer outside the country. Kind of, yeah.
Right.
And now it's like, in Tanzania, all over, all the other Vodacom markets use it. It's not South Africa as much.
Yeah.
And then obviously all the other telcos have designed their own. So MTN has their mobile money, Momo.
Yeah.
And then Orange has Orange Money, Airtel Money. They all have their own versions now. And we're seeing them become more interoperable with each other.
I was going to say, because
otherwise it's a bit of a pain if you want to send to your friend or your sister, but she's on a different network.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are becoming like more integrated. And what we're seeing in Africa is a lot of these telcos are actually they want to become just technology companies, not just operators. That's the plan for the MTNs of the world.
Similar mega trend here as well.
Yeah, because I mean, if you've already got your loyal people who are using your service, and now you can just sell them more things. I mean, of course.
Yeah.
Why not have all these extra digital services?
So they're using the sort of Mpesa type stuff as like and having got into the application side of that as well as a sort of springboard to move into other areas as well.
Yeah. So I mean, there's that side of it, and then the telcos they've always offered like device insurance, but they've grown their insurance businesses a lot. They offer life insurance, all sorts of things.
Okay.
Now a lot of like loan products. So something that's very popular in South Africa, like one of the Vodacom things, is called Airtime Advance. So if you can't pay for your airtime, they'll give it to you, and then you pay it back later.
Yeah.
But now they're expanding that, and a lot of other companies are doing it too, into other things. Like you can get an advance of like a small amount of cash to do something. So it's nano loans.
Yeah.
It's done well in Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa.
It's fascinating. That's one of the things I find most fascinating about these other countries. So like, we're famously in a cost of living crisis right now, and everyone's worried about energy bills and inflation and that kind of thing. But of course, for me as a, let's say, middle-class English person, my concerns are, am I going to be able to buy exactly the food that I fancy at Sainsbury's or some random shite off Amazon or something like that? And then you've got other places where their concerns may be a little bit more existential. And then there are services sort of adapt to that. And then, as you say, the nano finance and that sort of thing. I'm never going to worry about finding a tenner here or there. But for someone who does, it can make a massive difference to their life. And I find, because it's so alien to what I'm used to, I find that whole environment really interesting.
No, it definitely is. And there's so many of these fintech companies coming up with interesting ideas. Another big one is people that sending money outside of the country, or like someone in the UK wanting to send money to an African country to relatives. Yeah. And I mean, traditionally that's been quite hard. So there are a lot of these like border transfer type of companies too. But I think regulatory, it's a bit difficult.
Sort of remittance type.
Exactly.
Like
remittance is a
Union
huge thing, especially
Yeah.
for the African continent, yeah.
And do they make
Go on.
money out of it though? The operators. I mean, has it been like? Presumably they take a sort of like a commission, like a percentage cut on the transaction price, and it's very small.
Yeah, so I
but
mean, there's lots of like startups who are doing it, but
Yeah.
then a lot of the telcos also have their own kind of financial services divisions now.
Right.
So yeah, they started off not making that much money, but they're definitely making money now.
Because I know whenever I look at, I mean, you mentioned Orange, which is probably one of the telcos that I look at that's mainly involved in Africa, I guess, out of the big European ones. I mean, I know Vodafone is, but it's always a bit unclear to
Under
me.
its various guises.
Yeah, because
it's more run by Vodacom,
yeah.
and then they're trying to sell Egypt, and
Yes, totally.
I don't know what they're doing in Ghana. They gave it to Vodacom to manage, but they still own it. It's a bit confusing. Yeah.
But Orange they always have you look at their sort of earnings updates,
Sorry.
and they always have quite a big section on their sort of Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah,
and
it's always such a big growth market for them.
Totally, yeah. And then one of the big growth things they always seem to say is to do with mobile money, I think is just how they put it. But it obviously covers more than just this stuff, how it started out. You don't get a sense... it's good that you provided the colour because you don't get a sense of all the different things they're doing under that sort of umbrella.
Yeah,
from
you've
that
got your
report.
traditional like mobile money thing is what it is, like transferring money. But I mean, yeah, you can get paid with that. You can, people's salaries could go through it, all that kind of stuff. So I think Orange Money is pretty big, and they actually started a bank too. Like there's an Orange digital bank.
Yeah.
They really are
which is
getting
in
into
Europe as well,
banking.
bizarrely enough.
But it's funny, like the telcos are getting into banking, and the banks are like trying to become
Trying to get
telcos.
into
Yeah.
But the thing that strikes me, again, in the digital transformation sort of context, a sort of enduring cliche or enduring talking point has always been, look, these operators have got this pre-existing financial commercial relationship with tons of consumers.
Yeah.
They should be doing a better job of, for want of a better term, exploiting that relationship. They wouldn't use, but they'd find some euphemism. They'd say sort of augmenting or whatever, God knows.
Value-added services.
There we go. Some way of just giving more back to the consumer. But it's there. You've got the consumer. There's only a certain amount of companies you have a recurring financial relationship. Yeah. And I don't know what it's like in Africa or South Africa or whatever. But here, there'll be my communication service provider is one of them. I actually get both my broadband and my mobile from EE. So I think I get paid them two separate bills. Anyway, whatever. So I've got this certain amount, certainly tens of pounds, probably getting close to £100 a month that I just give them. And there's a few other like utilities where you give them, and obviously your mortgage or your rent or whatever. But this is one of few companies that I, as a consumer, have this enduring, recurring, committed commercial relationship with. And they always say that they should be doing a better job of that. They should be doing a better job of getting more out of it and offering them more shit, given that it's already there. It's not like if I'm suddenly trying to sell stuff, but I've got no commercial relationship with either of you two. Establishing that commercial relationship is incredibly difficult. Yeah. But if I'm already selling Paula something, then I can try and sell her something else.
Yeah, and then if I'm looking for life insurance or whatever, and then you're like, oh, it'll just be easy. I'll just get it from these guys.
Are there banks in Africa trying to do that? Trying to sort of move into telecom? Or, do you see telcos trying to go into energy and things like that as well? Or?
A few of the banks in South Africa have their own like MVNOs on the side. So F&B was the first one, and F&B Connect's like doing pretty well.
Yeah.
And then, Standard Bank has their own... but they're not they're not building towers and whatever.
No, because
but running on
the barriers to
MVNO
entry
makes
so high.
sense.
Yeah. It's funny because the telcos always would say, well, the barriers to entry are really high trying to get into the telco sector because you've got to build, networks.
But not as an MVNO.
But having said that, we've still got a lot of companies building fibre, haven't we, in Europe? And you
or investing in it.
You can be an MVNO and then be successful and then maybe start to invest in your own network. And the banks could probably say, well, the barriers to entry into finance are really high because you've got to pay staff a huge amount of money to do it well, and you have to overcome all these regulatory hurdles. You have to know how to do that. And so this whole companies going into other sectors is, I don't like it because because that's exactly what the public clouds, not public clouds, the wrong way to describe them in this context, but the internet giants are that. They're companies that are, and at the end of the day, you can't have you can't have companies in all these different sectors going into everybody else's sector and expecting to survive. You just end up with a situation where there's over competition. So the natural conclusion is you sort of think about it 15, 20 years down the road.
And everybody else's face.
Well, no, it's three big internet companies providing everything.
But the flip side to what you just said.
I get what you're saying.
You know,
the flip side to what you said, Ian, is, you look at, again, the argument for operators diversifying and finding other things to flog to their punters.
Yeah.
Is, they look at.
But other sectors face the same problems, don't they?
It's but obviously we're talking about telecoms. They look at their ARPU, they look at their growth, they look at all their charts, and you're great at charting some of this stuff in your stories. Most of their charts are going in the wrong fucking direction.
Yeah.
And so they go, all right, well, what if we went here? We can't see how we can correct that and get us back onto a growth footing just off our core business.
I'm not saying I disagree with the commercial
imperative.
I can see why they're doing it. I'm saying from a sort of societal perspective, I don't think this is one of the downsides, I suppose, of the capitalist society hunt for growth. The need for GDP to be higher every year, the need for companies to make more revenue. You can't just have an organisation that goes, right, we sell smartphones, we sell telecom services, that's what we're going to do year after year, and we'll make it a bit better and we'll spend a bit more money and you'll all be happy with it. It doesn't work that way. There has to be this push for we go into another market,
because all the internal incentives are on rapid growth.
Exactly.
That's where you get your bonuses.
That's how capitalist economies work, and there isn't a better system, unfortunately. So I'm not advocating communism, by the way, and saying that we should be in this kind of controlled economy.
Are you saying?
But it's
fucking Jeremy Corbyn.
You think about where it goes. This is a bit of a tangent off the Africa stuff at the moment, but it's relevant for Africa as well. I think it's very relevant for Africa that you're going to have these big internet giants. If you think about this in the future, potentially, well, they already have. They've moved into all these other markets. They're now, we know, one of the big themes of the show, I think, this week was them moving into telecom and doing more stuff there. And by the way, not just on the back end, OSS hosting things side, but also in terms of services like WhatsApp and whatever it might be, which we all know has been well documented what impact that's had on telco sort of revenues, and I think in Africa as well, actually, especially so in some cases. It's you just feel it's all moving towards a world where they become the companies that I think they're better suited, to be honest with you, given their capital resources and technological sophistication, to be the companies that are these providers of various other services. It's just they haven't really had to worry about it yet. At some point, one of them will go, we're going to start doing energy. We're going to start doing banking services. We'll do home insurance, and they'll do it much more efficiently. They'll do it much more efficiently than any traditional insurance provider. And the traditional insurance providers have exactly the same problems the telcos have got now. Yeah. Which is you've got a hyperscaler able to do this in a really sort of agile way, where you can cancel something just like that. And the only problem will be that you can't speak to someone on a phone, but in every other way it'll work well and it'll be cheap and you'll be saving money, and all the traditional companies will get out of business. And then in the future there'll be one company called The Company, and aliens will be bursting out of people's chests.
Very dystopian. And Terminators will be fucking you up if you do the wrong thing.
That was a tangent.
Anyway, back to Africa.
No, but to slightly rationalise the tangent, I mean, it's still a tangent, Paula, but I'm just wondering if you think, because you are a person in your own right, not just the editor of Connecting Africa. Do you share some of Ian's concerns about a few super big tech companies poking their nose into too much shit?
I mean, I do. I think at this point, Google has too much information on me already. Like, it's too late.
Right. Yeah. I know there is that. Well,
you know what I mean? Like, a lot of it's too late. The bank has too much information on me. Yeah. Like, all the data that they have.
You can still moan about it.
Yes, you can, for sure. I think it is problematic, and it's always very interesting because a company like Google, then they, in Africa, they're always, saying that they're doing this, they're paying all this money, whatever, and like, we love their services, we use a lot of them, but yeah, you got to think about the background. Is it good for the world if there are too many of these, a few of these very big companies who are controlling everything?
Do you get a lot of, that sort of clash between the telcos and those companies that plays out in Europe a bit at the moment? Is on net neutrality and things like getting tech companies to pay money for network usage and that sort of thing. That's been an issue in Africa, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's coming out more and more in like taxes that they want OTT players to pay, and they haven't got that far in a lot of countries with it. But yeah, I can see it becoming more of an issue over time. There's a weird thing because I mean they'll still like partner with each other on things, but then they complain that
Yeah, it's a
whoever's
love.
not paying.
It's kind of a love-hate relationship.
Yeah.
Which is kind of how I thought it was a bit in Copenhagen. Actually,
Yeah.
There's
it was like, all right,
need
we
to-
accept it, but we're not entirely happy about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also we're at the point where what can you do about these OTT players?
Yeah.
Like they exist,
Yeah.
they're not going anywhere.
No,
Well,
that's a good point.
that was exactly
So-
what we were
That
just
was why I
saying
was
with,
making that
with
1984
James.
reference at the end of my story. Are there, again, just continuous tangent, it's fine. That's what we do.
Okay.
We do tangents. Are there, whether they're American or otherwise, like dominant sort of technology players in South Africa, for example? I imagine Amazon accounts for the vast majority of all consumer e-commerce that occurs in the
No,
UK.
we don't. Oh yeah, we don't have Amazon yet.
Don't have it at all.
Well, they're coming apparently.
So what about...
Oh, ka-ching.
Yeah. So Amazon Web Services has had a long history in South Africa.
Yeah.
Like
But not-
a lot of the
in
platform
terms
was
of consumer
designed
stuff.
by South Africa, well, engineers in
Yeah.
Cape Town, and so they've had data centers for a while now.
So that's
The
interesting.
actual
AWS is ahead of like old school Amazon.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we have like a few big players already,
Right.
like our own version.
Who's your e-commerce? If you're going to buy some crap off the internet?
It's called Take a Lot.
Take a lot.
Take a Lot.
Take a lot.
Yeah, Take a Lot.
Right, okay, fair
Yeah.
enough.
And that's
I'm
is
assuming
that,
the truck logistics in Africa must be
that's an African player.
really
Yeah, South African.
difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. In
Well, in urban
Nigeria, you have like
environments, I'm
Jumia
presuming-
and you have some other big ones.
Right.
In South Africa, there's lots of online kind of shops, but
And-
I would say that's one of the biggest
And
ones.
is
So I
Take
think
a
they're
lot
a
a
bit
South African
worried.
company?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not. I like the idea of there being sort of homegrown online companies that are doing things like that in a market, and but you sort of you wonder whether they have long-term
Whether when Amazon does
you know, when
that,
Amazon,
Amazon
when
goes,
Amazon
yeah, I think
arrives,
they're
it goes,
quite
hang on a
worried.
minute.
They
Yeah,
should be.
no doubt. Are people big consumers of things like, I mean, when we're on the podcast often we're talking about what we've watched the previous week or what movies to watch. It's always Netflix or Amazon
Yeah.
Prime or Disney.
Yeah,
but
we
is
have
there
all
a
of those
different
now.
sort of entertainment set up in the country as well?
I mean,
for-
we have the traditional kind of satellite providers,
Yeah.
but it's definitely going.
OTT. or
Yeah,
whatever.
I mean, for
Yes,
my
Lord.
generation, like my parents still
Yeah.
pay for like satellite for DSTV. It's like the big provider, but I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's too expensive. It's become too expensive. The only
So-
reason to have it is for sport.
So you'd have would you have a subscription to things like
Yeah,
Netflix, or whatever?
Amazon
yeah.
Prime, yeah.
Yeah.
So sports still like a big rugby or cricket or something like that? It's still-
Yeah, that's the only thing that they still have a hold on is all the sports rights are a bit difficult to negotiate, I think. The OTT players would love to, I mean, like the streaming services would love to be able to
Yeah.
get those, but like Supersport,
Amazon
Still
is
owns
making
majority.
great
Well,
moves.
they are-
Amazon is buying like
they
the
are
League
here.
One in France. They're buying some games here too.
yeah, I think it's like
they
the
bought all the
contracts are
tennis, yeah.
X length, so once the contracts are up, then I
Yeah.
think
Mm.
DSTV is going to have a
They come
problem.
with,
Amazon's bought all the tennis
undeniable
rights
offer.
in the UK, but
The what?
Amazon has all the tennis rights in the UK,
Yeah.
ATP, except they don't have the Laver Cup, which is the thing on this.
Yeah.
Federer's going to have his final.
Yeah. So I've got
In double,
my
though.
T-shirt on, Fred
Got
Perry
your Fred Perry
T-shirt,
t-shirt.
as another tennis legend bows out today. Thought it'd be appropriate to wear
Yes.
this particular T-shirt.
Apparently his fashion brand's doing quite well.
For Roger Federer's.
Mm.
I'm sure
Are
as
you-
soon
are
as
you
he
telling
announced
me
his
what we're
retirement,
doing?
he
We'll be doing
sold a
all-
lot.
Okay with money.
We'll be doing after this
I
evening.
know. Greedy
Can he look after
fucker.
the twins?
Yeah.
Okay,
Two
great.
sets of twins.
Two sets of twins, I know, it's insane.
So
Elon
yeah.
Musk has like 3 sets of triplets or something.
Who does?
Elon Musk.
Does
Elon Musk got
Yeah, but
kids
that's
everywhere.
my
from,
God,
artificial,
that's-
He's like a rabbit.
I mean, he has so
No,
many
those
children.
are-
There's still more that we don't know about, I think.
And in fact, he's even got a narrative where he goes, he thinks the world's underpopulated, and he seems to be taking personal ownership of the problem.
Is that his narrative that he thinks the world's underpopulated?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a very different idea to most other people.
There's a lot of old people in it, though. Maybe that's his point.
No,
I think
do you
it
know?
is.
I haven't looked into it that
I think
much.
he said that. Yeah, yeah. He said something
Yeah,
about
well,
ages and-
well, actually, you know, this. I mean,
Do you think he believes everything he says, though?
well, he does. He's South African.
I mean,
You should be on Team Musk, shouldn't you?
he doesn't like South Africa very much. He doesn't really identify as South
Right.
African
He did
anymore.
leave there when he was quite young, didn't
Yeah.
he? But what was I going to say? But you have got this. In fact, I mean, this has got nothing to do with telecoms. But you've got, you know, continents like Europe where birth rate's often below replacement rate, and then you've got continents like Africa where birth rate's definitely above replacement rate, and then you've got another big geopolitical story, which is the migration north into Europe, and that's a really interesting thing. But again, it's not a telecoms thing. I was just a tangent I went off on. I'm not going to ask you about that, don't worry.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to say about that.
So yeah, back to that. But you know what we were talking about, which is interesting, which is relevant to Africa, is these other sort of services that operators are providing. So you got the fintech thing, and I find that fascinating. Whether it's sort of micro loans or just mobile banking, all that sort of thing. I mean, almost to a point of mobile currency. Is there much opportunity in Africa to like tap with your phone, like sort of NFT type of? Is it NFC?
Near field communications.
Yeah, NFC. Like just basically tapping like with your phone.
NFV then.
Yeah, a lot of the banks have brought it in South Africa at least.
Yeah, and is the infrastructure there? Like, for example, on the tube, I can just tap to go on the tube and that sort of thing?
I mean, we don't have a tube. But
not that then.
Yeah, not that. More like payments at shops than other, I don't know actually. But maybe some of the bus systems, like in Cape Town or whatever, I'm not sure. But yeah, a lot of that. We have actually a very advanced banking system in South Africa.
Do they mine cryptocurrency there?
Yeah.
Is it electricity cheap?
Electricity is a real problem.
We were talking about that before we came
Yeah, South
on.
Africa's currently having like rolling power cuts, so it's really bad at the moment.
Why is that?
Because the national power company
infrastructure is bad.
have
it's just
real
sort of-
problems.
They're just fucking
So we
it
have
up.
this thing called load shedding that's been going on since like 2006 or 2007, I think.
Yeah.
So they'll switch off sections of the grid at different times to try to save energy. So there are 8 stages, and so you get turned off as it goes up more and more times a day. So currently
Right.
we're
Can
on
you tell?
stage 5 or 6.
Can you tell when you move from one stage to another?
They announce it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's not like,
And there's a schedule.
your light bulb gets a 1 order of magnitude dimmer or something like
No,
that.
they literally turn you off for 2 to 4 hours at a time.
Same as Venezuela,
Yeah.
Is it?
So I mean, at least there's a schedule, but at the moment it's really bad. They've had failures at some of
Does that
the
affect
power
you?
stations, and I mean not currently because I'm in London and there's power, but at my house, yes, of course.
But it's a bigger issue for the telcos, isn't it? Generally, the whole sort of power situation in
So it's something
the country anyway.
you don't think about, and people get so angry when the power goes off and then their phone doesn't work. But the operators are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in batteries for all the towers, but the battery, let's say it lasts for 6 to 8 hours, then it has to charge for 12.
Solar panels.
But the problem is that you get hit by another load shedding 3 hours later and another one. So the batteries don't get time to charge. It ends up killing them in the end. They have to replace them. They get stolen. Sometimes they have generators at the sites, but then they're burning diesel, which is really expensive.
There's no solar panels.
Does the diesel get siphoned off?
Solar, yes, but I don't know for towers exactly. Yeah, diesel gets stolen. I mean, solar obviously would be great for South Africa. Unfortunately, the solar panels also get stolen. It's all a big problem.
So, I mean, their site costs must be huge because they're having diesel generators there,
And
but presumably
security.
they've got security. Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
Exactly. So they really are spending a lot of money now. And, I mean, they're doing quite well keeping the networks going. But a lot of the time, as soon as the power goes down, the network goes down in whatever area you're in, even though they're trying to keep the batteries up running. But it's costing them a lot of money. And then, I mean, you think about all the other industries just being turned off. Imagine factories just being turned off for 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is problematic.
Well,
but
it's coming
it's the
here, isn't
reality.
it, now? It's certainly coming to Germany, this risk
Austria.
of blackouts and winter blackouts.
Well,
and
so that's the funny thing. You'd assume, again, I'm going to fall back on being self-conscious about generalising about an entire continent. But most of Africa's pretty fucking hot, isn't it? And so you'd
Not
figure...
always. I mean, we have winter.
Yeah, you have winter, especially in South Africa.
I would say
which is-
equatorial probably is hot
Yeah,
quite a lot of the time.
well, South
yes.
Africa is probably the coolest African country on the whole,
I mean, the people are pretty cool, yeah.
as you are evidence of, Paula. But on the whole,
Yeah, it can
Africa's
get
pretty hot,
cold, for
and
sure.
so you'd figure that solar would be a particularly appealing technology.
Well,
in
yes, we have a
Africa
lot of sun,
if you
for
could
sure.
get the sort of capex to make it happen.
Yeah, so it's you're seeing more and more of it, especially big for enterprise. You have a lot of these companies rolling out solar for people's head offices, that kind of thing. So there's definitely a move to that. The government's been a bit difficult about alternative energy providers and actually giving them enough money, and it's a bit of a messy situation because the power utility, which is government owned, is trying to hold on to as much money
you
as they
always get
can.
that sort of thing.
But we've gotten to the point where they have to. We also have quite a lot of wind power
Okay.
in Port Elizabeth, places that are windy. So there are all those alternatives. I mean,
Actually, I would have thought quite a lot of the coastal bit of South Africa is quite windy, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. So you can have quite big wind farms.
and the telcos, you rely on that? Do they sort of draw sort of
I don't
energy
know.
from
It's actually quite
renewables at
an
all,
interesting
or?
one. I mean, all of them are trying to say they want to go carbon neutral and all
Yeah,
of
of
that.
course.
So I think they
That's
are
everyone's
getting
saying
more and
that.
more. Yeah, I mean, everyone has to, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely in the mix for sure.
Yeah.
what's quite interesting at the moment is also the data centers talking a lot about renewables, and because I mean data centers obviously take so much power, and in Africa, I mean South Africa, we have our issues now, but a lot of other African countries have equally bad, if not worse, power issues. So yeah, trying to like take data centers off grid, which is quite an interesting kind of idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's been interesting. A lot of like them talking about that at the moment.
Cool. So, Wells, remind us who are the big operators in South Africa? MTN.
Yeah.
I'm testing my own. Vodacom.
Yeah.
That's as far as I've got. That's not bad though.
Telkom,
I don't know shit about.
Telkom South Africa, yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
And
well
then
done.
Cell C.
Yeah.
And then we have a small player called Rain, it launched only with 4G.
Right.
And they were the first ones to launch 5G.
So there's 5. Are they all doing mobile, those companies? And they all have networks?
Yeah.
So it's quite a competitive market.
Yeah, it is.
Compared with some,
So Vodacom and MTN are the biggest. It's quite interesting what you were saying about towers and, you know, all infrastructure, the amount of money you pay for all of that. So Cell C has had a lot of financial difficulties over the years, but it's decided now it's selling all its towers and it's just going to like roam on the other networks because it basically can't compete. It doesn't have enough money. Sorry, it doesn't have enough money to build and catch up with MTN and Vodacom.
Yeah.
So basically, they're going to turn themselves into like an MVNO. Basically, they don't want to just call it that.
Yeah.
But and then some of the other, even MTN is sort of selling off their towers into a tower co.
Yes.
That then someone else can run.
Yeah, that's
That's a very trendy thing to do. now.
Also,
in Europe as well.
I think it's the power thing is a huge thing because now these tower companies are going to have to guarantee that on stage 6 load shedding they will stay up.
Yeah.
And then they're making it someone else's problem.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So I mean, it's
very
smart of
wise
them.
then, in that case.
So that's an interesting one. So obviously MTN's huge across Africa. Vodacom owns part of Safaricom in Kenya. It has operations in DRC, Mozambique, Lesotho, Tanzania, and then they're buying half of Egypt.
Right.
Well, not the country, Vodafone Egypt.
Yeah.
And then obviously Orange is like very big in Francophone Africa.
Yes.
And Airtel is pretty big as well across.
That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah. And then all the different countries have obviously their own small ones, some government owned.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Some markets have got like 2 or 3 players that are strong. Some markets have like 8. So it's quite interesting sort of looking at them. And then Ethiopia is a really interesting one at the moment because they've only had one Ethio Telecom, which is government owned up until now. And they want...
They're the last monopoly, really, last big monopoly.
Yeah, so Safaricom got a consortium of like investors, including Vodafone, etc., got a license there. So they've just launched last month, in Ethiopia. So it's the first like sort of independent operator to launch there. And they want to give another license, and they also want to sell a stake in Ethio Telecom, but that sort of stalled for some reason.
Right.
MTN wanted to go there as well. Well, a lot of them did, I think, but they didn't offer enough money, so the government declined them.
I remember Orange talking about being interested in that opportunity.
It's a huge market.
Yeah.
There's like 110 million people that live there. It's
so
one of the biggest
in
countries.
Ethiopia.
Second biggest in Africa after Nigeria,
Yeah, and so Nigeria's by far the most populous, isn't
Yeah.
it? Who's the dominant? Is that an MTN place?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They have quite
You forget that sometimes you...
big. Yeah.
I was looking at this when I was at...
It's their most profitable market, I think, Nigeria.
There's just so many people there. Jesus Christ.
And everyone has like 4 phones.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, I mean, they probably have all the providers.
Oh, so that's an interesting thing. Is that
4
just
SIM cards, not phones.
Is that just a Nigerian thing, or
No,
do you think that's an African thing to have multiple SIM
an
cards and
African thing
providers?
to have
Why is that?
multiple. So people will do it like maybe their data is cheaper on one network and the calls are cheaper on another.
So sort of hedging their bets.
Yeah, so sometimes it's that.
And it's all
I guess
prepaid still, pretty much, I'm guessing. Or
It's
is it
a
not
mix,
so much?
but a huge prepaid market, I would say.
Even in data as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you buy sort of a few gigabytes a month or whatever, however it works.
Yeah.
And that might be a better deal.
I mean, it
on
depends
one
who you are.
network
Some
than-
people will buy like 5 gigs for the next 10 minutes, They have
Right.
these deals. They have like all sorts of different deals so you can get cheaper.
Yeah.
If it's like
Spot
for the
deals.
hour or for the, exactly.
Right.
It sounds
So you've got to
almost
really be
like
on your toes to
Yeah,
get the
that you're
best
like, I
deal.
need to send some messages, so let me buy this for £5.
So it sounds like quite a vibrant market, and you're constantly shopping around and comparing everyone against each other.
Yeah, I mean, some people do.
Right.
And people like to have 2 phones. Yeah, I don't know. It's like a weird
It
thing.
sounds
But
like a
Nigeria
full-time
in
job to
particular,
get-
I mean, the regulator said that they estimate that there's 4 SIM cards linked to most people.
I think
Right.
it
They're
sounds like
trying
a
to get everyone
market
to
that's
register
massively ripe for disruption.
In
Like-
what way?
Well, if that's happening, and people have 4 phones and 4 numbers, presumably, and they're doing it because they're going, well, data's cheaper on this network and voice is cheaper on this one, and then I might get some other benefits from these others. Someone could go, well, let's use this as an opportunity to go with some relatively low flat rate tariff. You know, a bit like Jio did, for instance, in India.
Yeah.
And just basically pull all the subscribers and spend some money on a marketing campaign and say and make a big deal about how it's more sensible to have one phone and one number and more convenient.
Yeah.
You know, we'll bundle all this stuff together and hey presto. I tell you what, I'm
I guess
doing
it's
the
that
wrong
thing
job,
about-
Scott, aren't I?
Yeah. You should go into
Well, I
marketing.
don't know. You're pretty good at this job, to be fair.
I should go to Nigeria and offer my services.
Go on,
let's do it.
That's how it goes.
to
But
the
I mean,
operator.
then you do have the problem. Like, how did Geo do it? Because whose
Yeah, I know,
towers did they use?
I suspect it's not that easy.
Well, I tell you, that's a really interesting
Oh,
tangent.
yeah.
I was chatting to someone at the event who was much more clued up about the Indian market than I am, and I just sort of thought that Geo had too much of a leg up from the government there.
For sure.
I thought there was.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Well, that was my gut feel.
Yeah.
This
No.
guy was pushing back. I don't know what incentive he had to push back. And he may be right. He certainly knows more about the market, so I'm not going to second guess him just to support my lazy narrative. But yeah, he was kind of pushing back on that a little bit. I seem to remember
I
at the
don't think the
time it was
narrative's lazy. It's pretty well documented.
well, I think so. But, you know, he was there at the time and he knows more than I do. So I was deferring to him.
all those pictures of Ambani and Modi
out with-
hanging out with
yeah,
each
yeah.
other and being...
But is Geo still around? Like, is it still doing
It's the
well?
biggest
they're kicking
operator
ass.
in the...
They're dominant.
It's the biggest operator in the world, isn't
They've
it?
gone,
No, it's
they've
not in the
gone
world,
from
'cause China Mobile's
they've gone from
bigger,
nothing
but
to dominant in
Four-
about 5
400
years.
million
And
subscribers.
Are they making money though?
Well, that's a good question because I don't know if you're alluding to it, but initially they were just giving away data.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, I just didn't understand how
But
they
maybe
supported
they're-
it. I mean, it's a good market.
maybe
That was
they're
one of the
subsidised.
bits of
You got to make
pushback.
money
They
at
might
some
be
point.
subsidised by the fact that it's part of Reliance Industries, which is England.
Well, exactly. That was some of the pushback this guy I was chatting to was giving me. It was like
Somebody's paying for something.
there was a massive initial loss leader
Yeah.
thing where they were giving shit away, but it helps that the bloke's just
one of India's richest men
swimming in
and very
cash.
close to the Prime Minister.
But the thing I found dodgy at the time, and I was remembering it, I was trying to... It's probably being a
totally
journalist. You
dodgy.
write something, and then the next day you've forgotten about it because you move on to the next thing.
Yeah. So as you look at a story, you're like, who wrote that? Oh, I wrote that.
Exactly. But I seem to remember them suddenly getting these national licenses, which were thin on the ground at the time because it was all quite geographically fragmented in India at the time. And suddenly Jio got all these national licenses. I thought that was a bit easy.
Oh, it's not even just that. It's more favourable interconnect rates compared with the other
There we
operators.
go. That as well.
Oh, yeah.
You
I wish you'd been in the room when I was chatting to this bloke.
It was
Yeah, we had a bit of
blatant.
arguments.
It was so obvious. You look at there's a list of things that you can look at that were decisions that were taken that all went in Geo's favour and not the favour of. And now now there's a situation where they invited Vodafone in years ago, you know, and it bid and took over this business and then look how it's been treated since then.
Yeah,
and
totally.
they clearly have a sort of anti-foreign investors thing. There's no two ways about it.
I mean, that's not an unreasonable assumption. I don't think we can prove it, but it's not an unreasonable assumption. One other thing I'll say at this bloke, the only reason I keep saying this bloke and not naming him is because normally when I have these conversations, I don't take notes. I'll say, let's just have a chat.
Yeah.
And, you know, part of that arrangement is you want them to
I know
speak
who it
freely.
is.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. You want them to speak freely, but then you won't, you know, name them on things like this. But he said apparently Bharti, this is what got me onto it, because you were talking about Bharti in parts of Africa. Apparently Bharti's like bounced back. They're doing really well now. In fact, they're actually taking share from Geo in some places.
But the one that's it's like it's becoming like a duopoly.
Yeah.
And Vodafone might even, who knows what happens with Vodafone idea, because every time I look at their numbers, which isn't very often because you've got someone who covers India for light reading, so I only sort of delve into it when I'm wound up about something, but they always seem to be sort of down on subscribers and
no, it's just got to be a matter of time till they're dead. All that's happening is that the Indian government is occasionally taking a bit more of an equity stake in order to let them off a bit of interest on some of their debts. And that's obviously not sustainable. You don't need to be a mathematician to extrapolate that and see that sooner or later the Indian government end up owning the whole thing, and then they'll just put it in the corner with all those other acronyms, MBNL or whatever.
BSNL and MBNL.
There we go.
Well, we might be seeing some consolidation in South Africa because apparently MTN wants to buy Telkom.
Right. And
that's a big merger,
one, is it?
Yeah. Sorry?
Is Telkom the third biggest?
Yeah.
So that's quite a big merger.
First plus third. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound very...
I don't know if it's going to be allowed.
Yeah.
But in a
but
five-player
then-
market, you would think maybe
So
that's...
it was quite interesting because they admitted it, they put it out on the stock exchange news service, whatever.
Yeah.
Yes, we're in talks. And then Rain, which is the smallest one, said no, but they actually also want to buy Telkom.
Oh, okay.
So or
Rain wants to buy-
merge.
So is
the
Rain
fifth
quite...
biggest wants to buy the third biggest.
Yeah.
Are they backed by some proper money?
Yes.
Who's Rain backed by?
Some nice billionaires
Right.
who made money, doing other things.
I see.
Some
Okay.
tech billionaires back Rain, yeah. Well, I don't know if I would say billionaires, millionaires. I don't know how much money they have.
So maybe that's a better deal.
Depends
for
what
the,
currency.
for the
I don't know. I
regu-
mean,
for the
to merge them
regulator's
maybe.
perspective.
But Telkom's a bit complicated because it's still 40% government owned.
Right.
So the government would have to agree to.
Yeah.
So they're the biggest fixed line,
Right.
landline provider.
Yeah.
Old school they were, but now no one has a landline, and they have bought all sorts of other companies and they roll out a lot of fiber. They also have sort of a big fiber business. So it's an interesting one. I don't know if it'll all get sold, but their mobile business has been doing really well because they used to be the fourth biggest, and then they overtook Cell C.
Yeah.
I think last year or the year before.
I'm just.
And this is all going on now. This is all really recent.
This is about 2 months ago that
Okay.
they announced it. But then we've heard nothing, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's going on in these discussions.
Yeah.
But Telkom was also wanting to buy. No, which way around was it? Telkom wanted to buy Cell C. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's been lots of
Wow.
possibilities, but nothing's
M&A.
actually
It
happened
sounds like
yet.
it's right
M&A
for
shenanigans.
consolidation. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say we're running out of time.
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to ask Paula, just in terms of what's coming up, do you have a sense of what might be some interesting sort of trends or bits of news or just stuff that you're keeping your eye on for the next 6 to 12 months in Africa? Is there?
We're seeing a lot of events coming back. So Mobile World Africa is going to happen in Kigali next month in Rwanda. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what kind of the
We
new
got
trends.
R1 still thinking. Well, did R1?
And then Africa Tech Festival in Cape Town.
That's
What
the
used to be
informal
called
one, yeah?
AfricaCom, yeah.
Oh, that's called Africa Tech Festival now. Is
Yeah.
it? I'd lost track of that.
Yeah.
I went to the
There's AfricaCom and there's Africa Tech.
I've only been to there once. I went when I
Africa
just
Tech
started
That's
about
big, isn't
7
it?
years
That's
ago.
It is very
event.
big, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the first time it's coming back in person since 2019.
Oh, that's
Right.
cool.
So it's going to be nice.
So I think I
to
went in
see-
2017 or 18. I can't remember.
Yeah.
It was the 1 year I went.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting having so many telcos in one room together again and all of that. I don't know what the trends are going to be. It's always a difficult thing to predict. I think
I know,
we're
it's
going to
a bit of an
still see a
unfair
lot
question
of
to throw at you.
a lot of fintech is still going to keep going. I mean, startups are so huge in Africa. So the startup market, we're seeing some African startups get given a lot of money by big international players or who are kind of backing them. Fintech startups are getting the most money out of everyone, and
So because it's not Google
Nigeria.
and AWS.
Yeah, traditionally Nigeria gets more startup money than anywhere else.
Yeah.
Because it's the biggest market.
Yeah, and they have a lot of innovators there. So I think we're seeing some interesting stuff happening in healthcare, in all the sectors that you'd think are growing at the moment. Agri-tech is one I think is super interesting.
Yeah.
Just all the things that they're doing in the agricultural industry and with IoT and
Yeah,
all
and
that.
again, I'm going to generalise once more to be corrected by you. I assume most African countries, a greater proportion of their total sort of GDP and export and that sort of thing is through agriculture than
there still is a lot.
typical European country or whatever.
Yeah, and interesting kind of apps and things that are helping small scale farmers to sell their products more easily, or to find buy things in for the farm, or all sorts of interesting things. Not just your traditional what you think IoT measuring the soil
Moisture
and whatever they tell you about.
Yeah. John Deere's always going on about that sort of stuff, isn't it? That tractor company.
Yeah.
They're always on about IoT stuff like that.
I mean, they are pretty amazing, these tractors now that basically can drive themselves on a GPS coordinates. You can just set them.
Yeah.
But
the combine harvester turns itself at the end.
Yeah.
And,
I'm going to bear that in mind next time I'm walking the dog and I see some tractor coming towards me.
with no one in it.
I would still
It's
maybe
a
get out the
runaway
way,
tractor.
but
It could be a runaway
it's
tractor.
not like a self-driving car that knows that it must stop for a person. I don't think it's just on its course.
Actually,
and it's going.
when you think about it, that's the place to start doing it. It's a field. What can go wrong apart from mowing down a dog walker?
Well, if it
every
carries on
now and
over the
then.
hedge at the end onto the M1,
Exactly, that's when you got
then
to.
you're in trouble.
That's an issue. Cool. All right, look, I think we've done almost 2 hours on this pod. Paula, it's great to have you back. Hopefully, we'll get you back in the UK quite soon.
Yeah.
And anytime you're here, you're always welcome.
Thanks,
And
nice
it's
to
great
see
to
you
get
guys.
this update on what you do. So and maybe we'll get a pub and have a beer after if you're around. When are you flying back?
I'm leaving London tonight, but I'm not flying back for another week.
Oh, okay, you got other stuff to do.
Yeah, some friends
Cool.
to see.
All right, well, if you're around, I'd love to buy you a beer. So there we go. And we'll wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for listening. Make sure you join us for the next one.